Welcome to the meeting of the Planning Board for June 11th, 2019. We're going to take things, right now we're going to go with other matters first to start off the meeting. We have Jonathan Silverstein here from KP Law, right?
Yes.
To discuss as a presentation on Citizen Planner Training Collaborative for us today, and all the masses that are here to watch.
Good evening.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
So, yeah, usually I'm used to much larger rooms. I haven't done one of these on-demand trainings. It's great to be able to just focus with one board. As a general rule, there's probably a lot in here that you all already know. So I view the PowerPoint presentation as sort of a framework to guide us through the discussion, but I find that the most useful part of the training is just people chiming in with questions as we go through, and telling me that I can skip certain information if you all feel comfortable with it already. So I'll get going. So current comprehensive subdivision control was adopted in 1953. Most communities adopted subdivision control sometime in the 60s or 70s. I noticed that your current subdivision rules and regulations date to 79, but I don't know if that's when Danvers adopted subdivision control or if there was something in place before then. That becomes relevant sometimes with respect to A&R plans. We'll get to that in a little while. So, as you know, subdivision control has a overlapping but very different purpose and structure from zoning. And the primary thrust of subdivision control is not to regulate use, but to regulate the infrastructure of subdivisions to ensure adequate public access, utilities, and the like. So obviously sometimes zoning permitting deals with these same issues, but subdivision control, unlike zoning, is not a discretionary permitting process. It's really just making sure that objective standards and criteria have been complied with. And if they are, then the planning board generally doesn't have discretion to deny a particular project under subdivision control. Yeah, and this is just sort of addressing that. The intent is that if you meet the subdivision rules and regulations, an applicant is going to be entitled to endorsement. So sometimes there's confusion about what exactly a subdivision is. There's a very robust definition in Section 81L of the subdivision control law. It's two or more lots, and a lot is defined as a parcel of land that is used or available for use for building. And so that's where you get into A&R. I've actually had some interesting cases where someone needed definitive plan approval in order to create frontage, but only had enough land for one lot, and they thought, okay, well, I'm happy to build whatever the planning board tells me. I'll create a quote-unquote subdivision road to get to my landlocked parcel, and I'll have a one-lot subdivision. And the fact of the matter is that by definition, a subdivision is two or more lots, so you can't have a one-lot subdivision. So that parcel would require a frontage variance from the ZBA. So in order to not be considered a subdivision, the division of land into two or more parcels needs to show each parcel, if it's going to be a lot, we'll get to that a little more, as having frontage on sufficient frontage under your bylaw on one of three types of ways. So a public way, that's fairly straightforward, although sometimes ancient records come into play and it's not always so clear what is and is not a public way. Those can be interesting cases. A way that was that's shown on the plan, basically an approved subdivision road, or what's called a way in existence. And I don't know how frequently you have these cases, but this can be a very murky area. What constitutes a way in existence? First of all, it has to be a way that was in existence prior to your adoption of subdivision control, and that's why that date of, if it is 1979, when the town first adopted subdivision control, could come into play. Sometimes you have these old cart paths. Is that a way? Is it not a way? Or was it just, a lot of times it's old logging roads or farm roads or whatever the case may be. So the question is, was it in existence on the ground at the time the town adopted subdivision control? And if so, does it have sufficient width, adequate grades, suitable grades and adequate construction for the intended use? And this is one of the rare instances where the planning board can actually look at the proposed use of land, because what's adequate for maybe a two-lot residential subdivision might not be adequate for a two-lot commercial subdivision. And so obviously you want to look at the adequacy with those thoughts in mind. Adequate doesn't mean satisfying all the rules and regulations for a subdivision road under your current rules and regs, but it also is a more discretionary standard for the planning board than what we'll get to in a little while, what you've probably heard of, the illusory access standard. So it's not, it's sort of in between. The planning board has some discretion to determine what is and is not adequate for a particular use. So we've talked about the lots fronting on one of the three types of ways. It has to have, each lot has to have the minimum amount of frontage required under your bylaw, or there's this catch-all if there's no frontage requirement under your bylaw, and I doubt you have. There's some towns in Western Mass that have no frontage requirements in particular districts, but I doubt you have that in your bylaw. If you did, then it would be 20 feet. And you have to make a determination that vital access exists. So when you're talking about adequacy of a way for A&R purposes, when it's a public way, it's this illusory access standard. It has to be a constructed public way. It can't be a paper street that was accepted and laid out, but never actually constructed. The fact that there are simply deficiencies in the way would not be grounds for denying A&R endorsement, because again, the question is it adequate to provide vital access? So if it doesn't provide safe, practical access to the proposed building lots, then the road is not sufficient to justify A&R endorsement. And we'll get to some of the examples of where the court found that to be the case. Now, for purposes of approved subdivision roads, if the road is not constructed but there's surety in place, then the plan is entitled to A&R endorsement. If the road was never built, even if it's an approved subdivision, and there's no surety in place, then that doesn't do the trick for A&R purposes. And of course, you want to go back and check to see if there are any conditions of approval on the original subdivision approval that were never complied with, because the way as approved and endorsed on the original subdivision approval, if there are conditions that were imposed, whether it's drainage infrastructure or utilities or whatever the case may be, a cul-de-sac that was never built, then obviously you're entitled to deny A&R endorsement in those circumstances. So this was an interesting case and actually comes up more frequently than you might imagine, where there was a requirement to complete construction of the road within 2 years. That's not so uncommon, but the court determined that A&R endorsement could be denied in that circumstance because that was a condition of approval that wasn't met. So when you have waivers that have been granted on the original subdivision approval, and one of the conditions of the waivers, as you know, you're allowed to condition a waiver on no further subdivision. If one of the conditions of the waiver is no further subdivision, and then there's a further subdivision, then you can base that, you can use that as a grounds for denial of A&R endorsement. So as I said, private ways give the board a little bit broader authority in terms of determining what is adequate. I had a case involving a road that had previously served a bunch of sort of vacation lakefront cottages. Over the years, it got more built up. The lakefront cottages got winterized, expanded upon. Now all of a sudden you have 20-some full-size year-round single-family homes. Someone owns a lot or a lot of land on this road that would have adequate area. They came in, asked for A&R endorsement. The planning board said no. The road was 12 to 14 foot wide dirt road. Seasonally, there would be ruts. It would get smoothed out in the spring, and the court upheld denial of A&R endorsement in that circumstance. Where if that had been a subdivision road or a public way, the court may not have upheld that denial. So as I mentioned, the way needs to have actually existed on the ground as of the date that the town adopted subdivision control. So there might be a paper street. Someone might come in and want to construct it and call it a way in existence. And that doesn't fly. That doesn't constitute a way in existence because although it existed on paper, it didn't exist on the ground. That being said, in the Barton Properties case, the land court held that the board has to consider the current condition of the land. So if someone goes in on spec and decides to upgrade a road that did exist as of the date of subdivision control in the town, but maybe it was just a cart path or a logging road that wasn't in very good shape, they go in, they improve it so that it does provide adequate access, then at that point the planning board would have to grant A&R endorsement. Do you get a lot of way in existence A&R proposals?
Not really.
No, all right. Is adequacy of access usually an issue in your A&R cases? I don't want to dwell on it if it's not really something that.
Not that I
Okay.
can think of, yeah.
We just had that case near the river.
On Hardy Street?
Yeah.
Yeah. We did just have a recent one.
Yeah, that was the one, yeah.
It came up, so.
Yeah, it did
Okay.
come up.
All right, all right.
First time I've seen it. A long time.
So people get creative, and they'll come up with all sorts of plans that show technically sufficient frontage. This is an actual plan someone submitted for A&R endorsement.
Is that
Each of
pork-
the,
pork
what's that?
chop- Is that called Pork Chop Street?
Yeah, something like it.
My God.
Each of these lots has the sufficient amount of frontage that would have been required under the Nantucket zoning bylaw. And the court said, you know what, enough's enough, planning board, we're gonna uphold your denial of A&R endorsement here because of the strange turns, the long necks, in many cases narrowing down far below what the frontage requirement would be. And so the court upheld this denial. The court overturned this denial. The retreat portion of the lot maintained the frontage requirement for its entire length, and obviously it's a little bit different from this one.
Does that make any difference that Waltham has not adopted the subdivision control law, or, I mean, when this was in its Board of Survey?
Yeah, I don't think that's what the court based its determination on,
Yeah, I just didn't.
but, yeah.
Okay.
So this is what I was talking about. If there's a required frontage strip and it doesn't get narrower than the required frontage, generally the court's going to want to see endorsement. So this is where we get into what's usually termed the illusory frontage standard. If you have a guardrail, you have a steep slope, or wetlands that literally prevent use of the frontage to access the buildable portion of the lot, in those circumstances, the court has upheld denial of A&R endorsement. You know, your frontage is a limited access highway or something. But the mere fact that there's a lot of interior wetlands doesn't justify denial of endorsement. You're not supposed to really get into a determination of would this be a buildable lot or wouldn't it be a buildable lot. It's really just looking at the frontage and determining whether or not it's real. That's another case that was upheld. So I don't know if this is something that you've ever come across, but 81L is simply the section of the subdivision control law that contains all the definitions. But usually when people talk about the 81L exemption, they're talking about the multiple structures exemption. So there's one instance where a plan is entitled to A&R endorsement, even if one or more, even if all the lots may not have the requisite amount of frontage, or maybe any frontage on one of the three types of ways that that we talked about earlier. And it is where you have a parcel of land that has two or more structures, each of which predate the adoption of subdivision control in the town. So for discussion purposes, let's say it's 1979 in Danvers. You have a parcel of land that has no frontage. It's got sort of a common driveway that has historically provided the access. It's a big parcel of land. Maybe there's a main house and a guest house, and someone wants to come in and divide those two parcels, or divide the parcel into two lots, each of which will contain one of these structures. And those structures have been there since prior to 1979. Even if neither one of those lots has any frontage, even if those lots are going to violate just about every dimensional requirement in the zoning bylaw, it's entitled to A&R endorsement. Now, I had a case that actually went to the SJC for the town of Tisbury called Paylitz, and in that case, someone got A&R endorsement under this multiple structures exemption, and they did it basically as a predicate. This was back in the 70s, to then applying for a variance, which they then went in and got. Then the new property owner came in and said, you know what, I want to tear down one of the buildings and build a new, much larger residence. And the building inspector said no. She appealed that and said, well, look, and this is the owner of just one of the lots that was divided back in the 70s. She said, obviously the fact that that this 81L plan was endorsed has to have some zoning significance, because unlike your typical A&R plan, there's not even any requirement for adequacy of frontage. And they made the argument, what other purpose could getting this 81L or 81P endorsement do if it wasn't intended to create basically a lawful lot. And the SJC upheld the denial of that building permit and said, no, there are a lot of purposes that can be served by going and getting an A&R plan. One of them, as exemplified here, as a predicate to applying for a variance. Another might be you have two structures, and that's what the local 911 dispatch wants to see a lot line to give two different addresses, or the postmaster. Another one might be just to get a 3-year zoning freeze. So there are all sorts of reasons people go in and get A&R plans endorsed, and there's no reason to read into it the notion that it conveys any sort of zoning protections. So these are just some of the cases. And you know, the one thing that does come up from time to time is how substantial a building, a structure has to be entitled to this type of endorsement. Can it be a shed? Probably not. A one-car garage? Probably not. A one-car garage with a studio above it? Maybe. You know, it's a little bit of a gray area. So you definitely want to look at the details of what was in existence at the time of subdivision approval. Because you might have had a small barn that was expanded over the years subsequent to adoption of subdivision control. So the distinction between a building lot and a parcel is simply whether or not the parcel of land is available for use for a structure. So people might come in and divide a parcel of land into two non-buildable parcels, or one buildable lot and one non-buildable parcel, with the idea of maybe selling the non-buildable parcel as assemblage to an abutting property owner, or whatever other purpose. The only time in which definitive subdivision approval is required is if it's creating two or more building lots. Yeah, so you're probably familiar, I'm sure, when you endorse A&R plans, you frequently require non-buildable parcels to be labeled as such. You probably have a standard endorsement that endorsement of an A&R plan shouldn't be construed to convey compliance with zoning. There are all sorts of other types of endorsements and statements that in specific instances you might want to put on an A&R plan, and that's entirely appropriate. These are just some of the types of endorsements that get put on plans from time to time. So sometimes you might get an A&R plan that clearly shows zoning violations, and unless it is a frontage violation, you can't deny an A&R endorsement on that basis. But what you can do is call that out on the plan to reduce the risk of someone buying one of these parcels and being surprised down the road that it's not buildable.
So in Danvers, I mean, I can see what a lot of this is, you have septic systems, right, and it won't perk. What are we gonna run into? Wetlands mainly, that it's not buildable?
Yeah, well, certainly, I mean, it can be non-buildable for any number of reasons. It can be under the Wetlands Protection Act. It can be under zoning. You might have a parcel that is undersized, that's shown as a potential building lot. You can't deny it on that basis. As long as that parcel has adequate frontage, you still have to endorse. Because again, they might be coming in and saying, look, I just want to get this plan endorsed so that I can then go into the ZBA and show them the specific lot I want to create with a area variance. So that might be one reason. But certainly, I mean, no one could ever say that getting an A&R plan approved is a guarantee that the parcel is going to be buildable, particularly if it's all ledge and there's nowhere to put a septic system. I don't know. right, so that's pretty much it on A&R plans. Any other questions? Okay. So preliminary plans, it's interesting, I find different towns, the tool of submitting a preliminary plan is used much more frequently than others. I don't know if it's something that applicants come in to you with a lot of preliminary plans. It can be a really useful tool, basically just to get informal input from the planning board prior to spending all the money on creating definitive plans. But it's primarily an advisory tool. There's no right of appeal. Denial doesn't preclude coming in with a definitive plan showing the exact same configuration. So it's really intended to sort of streamline the process. The only actual legal implications it has are with respect to the deadlines for the planning board to act on a subsequently filed definitive plan, and possibly with respect to zoning freezes, depending on the timing. So you have rules and regulations. They're from the 70s. I think I did see that there had been some updates over the years. But if there's one thing I would encourage you in the spare time, when I know that there's always pressing needs, I have found that a lot of subdivision rules and regulations, I didn't look at yours in great detail, but a lot of subdivision rules and regulations could use some updating based upon modern planning, and so that might be something long range for the planning board to be looking at. Again, if a plan shows compliance with the rules and regulations, doesn't request any waivers, the plan is entitled to endorsement. Usually, plans are mailed in, but someone is entitled to just walk into a planning board meeting and drop off a definitive plan, and that starts the clock. I don't know if that happens very frequently here. It's not the most considerate way to go about things, but sometimes applicants do it. So unlike, I assume under the zoning bylaw, the planning board is special permit granting authority on certain things. So unlike that, of course, which requires a supermajority of the board, simple majority is required for approval of an A&R plan or a definitive plan. It does require a public hearing, as does any amendment of your rules and regulations for subdivision. Rules and regulations for zoning do not require a public hearing. And then the definitive plan has to get recorded. 81X plans aren't really something that the planning board has to worry too much about generally. So rules and regulations don't require town meeting action, require a public hearing. You want to make sure to, if you ever do update them, to file them with the clerk. And this is something that's easy to overlook with the land court as well. So unlike A&R endorsement, definitive plan endorsement does require compliance with the zoning bylaws. So if a definitive plan shows an undersized lot, that is a basis for denial of definitive plan endorsement. You can adopt a regulation that specifically states that zoning compliance is required, but even if you don't, case law indicates that it's a grounds for denial. And this is something that a lot of people don't necessarily or aren't necessarily aware of, which is that a board, in considering the adequacy of vital access for a subdivision, can consider the condition of the public ways leading to the subdivision. It's a little bit of a slippery slope because, of course, the applicant doesn't necessarily have any ability to improve those conditions, and that's entirely within the purview of the town, but there are some old public ways in certain towns that are in really rough shape, and it might be adequate for a 5-lot subdivision, but it might not be adequate for a 30-lot subdivision. So those are things that the board can consider. You want to make sure that that's in your rules and regulations if you're going to consider that.
Can the town require as a condition off-site improvements to, for instance, we did it over at Chill Farm, I think they were doing water line improvements or sewer line or water line improvements, and I can't remember if we required them to be involved in that or not, but I think it was definitely considered. Is that taboo, or is that?
No, you can require off-site improvements with a couple of caveats. They have to be reasonable. They have to, be necessary to provide for adequate utilities and access to the subdivision. And what it can't be is essentially delegating to some third party the ability to deny the subdivision. So for instance, let's say you wanted to require a sidewalk, but the sidewalk would be on an abutter's property, and the applicant would have to get permission from the abutter. You can't require a post-approval approval by some third party over whom neither the board nor the applicant has any control in order to essentially provide an appeal-proof denial of the
But doesn't the town
definitive
have
plan.
rights to put a sidewalk on?
If it's in the layout of the road, the town would have rights.
Because
But-
that particular subdivision, there is no sidewalk to that area.
Yeah. So, I see this issue come up a lot. And so the question is, well, first of all, is it a town road or is it a state road?
It's-
Is the town going to allow construction of the sidewalk?
Yeah.
So usually what I recommend is that the condition be worded in a way that provides a safety valve, right? If the applicant is unable to get whatever approvals are necessary from the property owner, from the town, from whoever it is, after diligent efforts, then you're not going to hold them to something that's literally impossible based upon, some third party.
Like in that example, you had, I forget, it was a 25-lot subdivision that kids are gonna go to school, and, we had to increase the water main and, those services, which I think they did participate in the cost of extending the water main down to that subdivision, because it was kind of in a somewhat remote area, and then, the argument is, well, shouldn't there be sidewalk to connect to children that might attend a school down, it's a few miles away, but it would seem to me it would be somewhat reasonable, especially when you have a subdivision of that size.
Yeah. So you wanna be able to ground it in your rules and regulations, right? It's a lot easier generally if they're looking for a waiver of some kind, because that gives you a little bit more leverage. Otherwise, if it's not grounded in your rules and regulations, it's a questionable condition. Particularly if it's off-site, because that off-site improvement might be benefiting the community at large as much or more than this particular subdivision. From what you're describing, it sounds reasonable, and I'm assuming they didn't appeal. But yeah, as a general rule, you are, as I mentioned earlier, you're allowed to consider the public ways giving access to the subdivision if the public ways giving access to the subdivision don't have sidewalks, and there's a determination. And one thing I always encourage boards to do is use peer reviewers, get consultants at the table, because if it's a recommendation of a peer reviewer, then it's going to give you a lot more credibility if and when you get in front of a court.
So with respect to utilities, though, for instance, the subdivision could be completely approvable, but the Board of Water and Sewer Commissioners could deny a connection or something like that down the road. Not that that would happen.
Yeah, there's a whole body of case law about when people are entitled to connect to public mains if they have frontage. But if there's a moratorium or
Yeah.
something else, then yeah, that's certainly something that the board can consider. And at that point, you'd be looking to the Board of Health, which of course has to make recommendations on a subdivision. Is there a place to put a well in? So those sorts of considerations are absolutely within the board's purview.
And I've also seen with respect to improving ways leading to the subdivision, you know, if the way leading there is an unaccepted way, it's a different story than if it's a public way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, if it's a private road,
Right.
and I see this a lot. First of all, if it's a private road, it's easier to require upgrades, particularly if it's inadequate. Second of all, you want to be satisfied that the applicant has the right to make those improvements and to use that access. You don't have to, you're not the land court, you're not required to adjudicate private property rights, but you want to make them at least provide some sort of prima facie showing that they have the right to use these private ways. So as I mentioned, there's very broad discretion on the part of the planning board whether to grant waivers. The one caveat I would give to that is if you have waived the granite curbing requirement in your rules and regulations for the past 20 applicants and the 21st applicant comes in and asks for that waiver and you deny it, you want to have a reason for doing so. It's, you want to avoid the argument that you're being arbitrary and capricious or singling people out, but as a general rule, you have very broad discretion in whether and under what circumstances to grant a waiver. That gives you, in turn, broader authority to impose conditions. And even if those conditions aren't necessarily required under your rules and regulations, and the finding you have to make is that it would be in the public interest. So a lot of times you see waiver requests, people don't want to pave the road to 34 feet as may be called for under the rules and regulations. Why might that be in the public interest? Well, it's in a sensitive area and having less impervious surface is actually in the public interest, and you're not sacrificing public safety because it's only a certain number of lots, whatever the case may be. That's the sort of analysis that you want to give.
So that's a good question. For us that are new, right, newer, and there's been a lot of newer members, do we keep a database of waivers that we've been given so that we can look back and say, historically, we've done so many waivers in these subdivisions? And obviously, David, you're new, right?
Yep.
So I know in the banking industry, we need to do that all the time with our regulators. What type of waivers are you granting, and are you consistent? I don't know if I've ever seen that before. Because it's easy to say, hey, I don't want granite curbs, it's too expensive. Well, if that's the case, should that really be should that be one of the things that we change in our, stuff like that?
No, it's a good question. We certainly do have a database of all the subdivisions in the past. There's not a column, as far as I know, for waivers in there, but it can definitely be added. That's a good suggestion.
Yeah, mainly it comes up in conversation as we're going through it from people who remember.
Yeah, that we did
Previous,
it for
yeah.
someone else before, and, okay, that's,
And one thing that courts recognize is land use permitting is one of those areas where every case is different. The facts, the piece of property, the development, the design, there's so many different variables that go into whether or not a waiver should be granted, a special permit should be granted. As a general rule, it's not an argument, that an applicant can make, hey, you granted something similar to someone 5 years ago, so you have to give it to me. So I don't want to convey that.
no, I
But
get
if-
that. But it's a
if-
fairness issue, right?
You want to be able to articulate the distinctions as to why in one instance you do something, in another instance you do
Yeah, makes
something
sense.
different.
Since we're not engineers either, right, so we're so reliant on third parties to give us
Yeah,
their professional
exactly.
opinions.
Exactly. We'll probably get there in a little while, but generally, does the planning board retain peer review engineers or other consultants when it has subdivision applications?
We have in-house staff.
Okay,
Who deal with some of that, but we're looking at peer review
okay.
going forward.
We've done it for a few projects
Yeah, I can think
Over
one or
the years.
two, yeah.
over the years we have. Yep.
For
Bill and I have been on the board for
For a
20
while.
a little while now.
So we
Jim's
have
a
done
senior
it.
member,
We have done it.
but, yeah, between the two of us, we remember. I remember one in particular, Folly Hill,
Yeah.
when the,
That was
The
a big,
riprap,
big,
yeah.
big contentious project with
Mhm.
300-foot wall of riprap and a lot of
What
neighbors.
could go wrong?
And we actually went to litigation.
Yeah.
So we all got sued and, but it eventually got billed and we're actually still,
Still
we
working
still
on it.
have
Still
not
working
finished
on
it.
it, yeah.
It's over 10 years in the making. It's just,
well over that, yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, it's, most of the time we've used peer reviews if there's been dispute between the applicant and the town in-house staff.
Okay.
That's usually when we've gone to peer review. So it hasn't been off.
And for traffic as well, you use in-house?
Yeah, we've got, we have got a traffic control committee,
T-TAC.
DTAC, that works on it. And we'll get recommendations from them when traffic is presented from us for a subdivision. We've probably done more actually peer reviews with traffic than anything else, now
Yeah,
that I think about
especially
it.
for like commercial stuff
Yeah, that's probably when we've done it more often than anything else.
on the local highways.
Because we didn't
114.
feel DTAC was addressing certain situations, so we went to a peer review. That's probably, yeah, now that I think about it, I forgot about traffic, yeah. But I don't think we've done one in about a year or so, so I don't think you
I
guys have
don't-
seen any.
I don't remember seeing one, to be honest with
Yeah,
you.
it's probably been a couple of years since we've done any peer reviews.
You can also use it, by the way, for council, if you have a thorny legal issue and, you need town council to attend, so that
Yeah,
that's
we-
also something
So a
else.
lot
We
of
have referred to town
a lot
council a
of
couple
the smaller towns require the peer review, probably because they don't have the resources.
Yeah, or
staff.
larger towns where, they might actually have a town engineer,
Yeah.
but that town engineer is pretty tapped out with, other projects or, yeah.
What about the 2C waiver? Do you see that a lot in other towns? Or I know we have a few properties, few areas of town that's been put in place,
The what?
where you basically can avoid the subdivision control law and put a, Nancy's the expert on that. You can put in a subdivision, if you will, but you see it more so where you have say a parent in the front and you have another house in the back with a child living in there, but we've had,
Oh, is this under your zoning bylaw? You might,
Yeah.
you have like a retreat lot provision or common drive provision?
yep, yep.
Two houses on one lot, provision in the subdivision, rules and regulations,
Oh, okay,
that's what it is.
okay. Yeah, so, again, if it's allowed for, then a lot of towns have those sorts of provisions where, a lot of towns actually have common drive bylaws where, you might allow up to 4 lots to be served by a common drive that meet certain standards. I see that more frequently in more rural communities. But a lot of towns are looking at those sorts of provisions, secondary, tertiary unit bylaws, accessory dwelling unit bylaws, and a lot of that is fueled by the housing
Yeah.
crisis,
Yeah.
as ways to maybe build a little bit of density without, having a lot of multifamily housing. So there are all sorts of different tools, but
Yep.
so, so did you say most of your lots are on Title V systems? Do you have town sewer?
No, it's all
You have
town
sewer,
sewer.
yeah, so the Board of Health report is probably less useful here, though it's still technically required. Might be honored in the breach, but usually that's dealing with Title V
We
systems.
get very little from Board of Health.
Yeah. All right, so constructive approval. Every year I have a handful of cases where deadline gets missed and someone says, but the applicant agreed to all the continuances, they never raised a problem. but there's no actual written agreement to extend the deadlines for the board to act. So I see that less frequently in towns that have professional planning staff, but not exclusively, and so, it's always just something you want to keep an eye on. So it's a 90-day deadline for a non-residential subdivision or for a residential subdivision that was the subject of a preliminary plan. And then it's, of course, 135 days for a residential subdivision that was not the subject of a preliminary plan. That deadline, of course, can be extended by written agreement. You want to make sure to get it in writing and file it with the town clerk. Most towns, I assume you probably have a form that you just have someone sign off on and stating a specific date. But then you, of course, want to keep an eye on that specific date. The nice thing about subdivision control as opposed to zoning is there's a nice safety valve, even if you constructively approve a definitive plan. And it's an 81W modification. As soon as you realize that there's a constructive approval, and hopefully you never ever have to worry about it, the next thing you want to do is have a meeting to give notice to the applicant of your intent to hold a public hearing to consider modification, rescission of the constructively approved plan. And you want to do it before they go out and mortgage or sell all the lots. Performance guarantees is another area that I see a lot of issues come up. So there are 4 types of performance guarantee. Obviously the covenant, where you can't build on or convey any of the lots subject to covenant. And then there are 3 types of financial sureties. So there's a deposit of money or negotiable security, so someone can bring in their Coca-Cola stock and post that as financial surety if they want. By a lender's agreement, a tri-party agreement, where a portion of the construction funding is held back to secure the infrastructure, or by a bond. Now, something that a lot of applicants try to get planning boards to accept are letters of credit. I don't know if that's ever anything that applicants have come in with before. In my opinion, a letter of credit doesn't satisfy any of these, that doesn't fit within any of these acceptable means of surety, but I know that a lot of planning boards have accepted them historically. So there are a lot of traps in letters of credit in terms of how they get paid out. I think someone said that they're in banking.
Well, I would tell you that the letter of credit is the direct credit of the bank, right? Compared to because I'm not a big believer in the tripartite agreement.
Yeah.
I mean, that's just a contract, right? And how does the board know the lenders really held that money back?
Yeah.
But a letter of credit, so that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I agree, it's not one of the things that they list.
Yeah. So it all there.
And
A
I
lot
know
of times
A lot
people-
of towns got, I don't mean to interrupt,
No, no,
but a
no.
lot of towns got into trouble during the banking failure, right? When the bank failed, and maybe they were holding a letter of credit.
A lot.
A lot of people got
That was a
hurt.
big problem.
Yeah.
And then previous to 2008, back in the 90s during the S&L crisis,
Right.
that was a big problem as well. So
It's an interesting thing about it, isn't
it is an interesting thing, and a lot of boards accept it as surety in zoning context, because of course you grant a special permit, you can require surety. You're not limited to these statutory forms of surety under subdivision control law. But there are some pitfalls to look out for in terms of how the letter of credit is worded and what the process is to call it. But there are with respect to bonds and tri-party agreements as well. So you definitely want to have those looked over by counsel.
What about, I mean, isn't a lot of the disputes over how much is really needed to finish?
Yeah.
And how much more it costs to bring someone else in compared to the original applicant?
So that's a great point.
What's reasonable from a contingency standpoint,
Yep.
right? I don't even know if we have a standard when we look at that.
Usually it's 10%, but
Yeah, but I'd say to you 10% to bring someone else in.
so many instances where you get financial surety, 5 years later, costs
Right.
have gone up, and not only are things not completed, but some things were done the wrong way,
Right.
and so you have the cost of undoing what was
Right.
done, and the surety is vastly inadequate. So again, if you have a strong engineering department, you definitely want to lean on them, peer reviewers, the same, and you want to try to get that updated. And absolutely, if someone's coming in along the way and looking for reduction in surety, you want to really make sure that, that the reduction is warranted based on existing conditions and existing pricing, because you
Right.
can update the pricing at that time too. So that's definitely something to look at. The other thing that I see a lot of boards do is that maybe you have a 10-lot subdivision, and the developer comes in and they say, look, we've put the binder course on, and, you know, we haven't put in all the catch basins, but, you know, we want to get these 4 front lots released so that we can get some capital and use that to finish everything up. The 6 lots remaining are worth well more than the cost of completing the infrastructure. So will you just release those front 4 lots, and you don't need financial surety, because those 6 remaining lots are worth, you know, 5 times what it's going to cost to finish the infrastructure. And the issue there is that that's not only is that a bad idea, and we can get to why it's a bad idea, but it's also just not allowed, because the subdivision control law says that you can release a lot under one of 2 circumstances. All of the infrastructure necessary to serve that lot is complete, or financial surety has been posted sufficient to complete that infrastructure. And the reason is obvious. You can go after a bond, but you can't go after a lot that's under covenant and, you know, have it sold and then use those proceeds to finish the infrastructure.
And if the market collapses, you're in trouble.
Yeah, and
We don't-
even so, you literally don't have the ability to do that. So surprisingly, that's really something I do see a lot of planning boards having done, and I see it when, you know, the developer's walked away because the lot isn't worth what it's going to cost to finish the subdivision, and the 5 homeowners in that subdivision are clamoring, hey, you guys got to come in and
Finish it.
and finish it. So a little bit of a trap for the unwary. As I mentioned, the board has the ability on its own or on application to modify, amend, or rescind a definitive plan approval. The one thing to bear in mind is that it does not apply to any lots that have been sold or mortgaged in good faith. It would apply to, you know, all the lots under covenant being sold to a different developer. That developer would be subject to the modification, but it wouldn't apply to individual homeowners who have bought those lots. And then, of course, you hope that the building inspector is paying attention to the requirements of the subdivision approval and not issuing building permits until satisfying himself or herself that that's been satisfied. So that's the end of the PowerPoint. I don't know if there are any questions, generally. Yeah?
What about a condition on the size of the structures on the lot? That same subdivision I talked about earlier, we had, like you had just mentioned, we had an initial developer, and they promised us the world, and they were only gonna have 2,500 square foot houses with 55 plus living, and then and we bought it, agreed to it, approved it, and they got bought out or sold to a big developer who put in 5,000 square foot homes.
Yeah.
And we didn't have
So
that
this was-
condition in writing.
Oh, yeah.
So do you see that a lot, or do you see that it's within our purview?
I mean, that specific issue, I don't see, let me say something generally, and then I'll come back to that. It doesn't matter what a developer shows you, whether it's, you know, in a special permit application or, you know, what they tell you during a hearing. If it's not you know, in the case of definitive plans, if it's not in the plans, if it's not stated as a condition of endorsement in your approval decision, it's not enforceable. And so I always say, this isn't a zoning training, but when I give zoning trainings to boards, I always say, you know, if you're asked for, to grant a special permit or a variance and someone shows you a really modest, nice house and that's what you have in your mind when you're granting the variance or the special permit, and that's important to you, state as a condition, you know, refer to that specific elevation, that specific plan, and say that a condition of the approval is to build exactly what's there, and if they want to do something substantially different, they have to come back to the board. So that's just a general piece of advice. Going back to your particular issue, as a general rule, I don't usually see in the subdivision context those sorts of conditions, because again, subdivision control isn't really a use authorization. I suppose if someone were asking for waivers, right, and if they came in and maybe your subdivision rules and regulations require
It was a
a
cluster.
playground
It was a
or
cluster
a-
development because of wetlands in the back. So instead of putting in these bowling alley lots with wetlands in the back and maximizing the lots, we allowed
so they did it as a
them to
cluster.
do the
Most
cluster.
I assume that cluster developments require a special permit.
Yeah.
Okay, so there you go. I would say that's an appropriate condition in your special permit, more so than in your definitive plan approval.
But
So,
I'm sorry to cut in.
no problem.
Aren't we changing the rules from what the zoning setbacks were already set at?
Well-
Aren't you changing it though?
No, they came in, that's how they sold the idea. We're gonna build smaller houses, 55-plus community, to sell the concept to the community. That's how they, you know,
Right.
to try to get the approval for the cluster.
No, that I understand.
But they weren't, you know, dimensionally looking for any variances or anything from the size of
But
the
if you're-
setbacks or the sidelines or anything like that.
But if you have certain requirements in your zoning bylaws for both special permit cluster subdivisions or traditional subdivisions, how much purview do we have to start changing those dimensional requirements?
Only what the zoning bylaw gives you.
Because
Obviously, I
that's-
don't have your zoning bylaw in front of me, but a lot of times the zoning bylaw cluster provision will say, you know, certain types of developments, you know, maybe it's an over 55 development, you can get a density bonus, and, you know, if you dedicate a certain amount of open space, you can get a density bonus, you know, and so it's all gonna be dictated by the bylaw.
Right.
By definition, cluster developments usually are smaller lots.
Sure.
And, you know, so in that way, you're varying what normally would be allowed under a conventional plan.
But you can still max out the size of the lot, the house.
And that's what you end up with,
Right.
huge
Right,
houses on
right. And
very
so,
narrow lots, tiny lots.
you know, and that's a circumstance where you want to state it as a clear condition in the special permit. Sometimes you get into, sometimes there are questions about what you can do in terms of limiting the size of single-family homes.
Well,
Chapter
this was
48,
something that-
Section 3 actually says you know, you're not allowed to regulate the size of
There was
single-family.
opposition, this was their negotiating tool, and they volunteered
Yeah,
to build smaller.
and that's when you grab it and you say,
And we took their word for
Then
it,
you make it a
and we
condition.
should
Make it
have,
a
we should have
condition.
made it a
If
condition,
they're
but we
gonna
did.
use it that way.
So it was a hard lesson,
yeah,
but because they are volunteering, they're the proponent of it.
that's right. I
Because we
was-
weren't saying, no, we'll let you have this many lots, but they're gonna be small houses. You know, they
Right.
volunteered that.
I
That's
would
how
say
they
a
sold the
condition that
idea.
doesn't get appealed is a legal condition. Yeah. So,
But if you start trying to control the dimensions by putting conditions in, whether it's a special permit or not, to keep the house size smaller, shouldn't you just go back and look at your zoning regs and start changing those setbacks to accommodate the size houses that you want on that size lot?
Yeah, but then
it's
we gotta
hard
go
to do
town
that
meeting.
because you're usually not gonna,
That's it.
you're
But if
you're
you're gonna
usually not,
continue to look at it that way, I'm just saying, if the
Yeah.
board's gonna fight for smaller homes, maybe due to density in the town, then it's almost like you have to do it broad-based instead of just on an individual basis.
In
for
other
one person or
communities
another.
I've worked in the zoning bylaw, it specifically said there was a special permit that you could apply for smaller homes. You got more of them,
Yeah,
but the
Okay.
sizes had to be
That
limited.
makes
So if
sense.
you're applying for that exact special permit, under those provisions, then there you go.
Similar to a different version of a cluster.
Yeah, exactly.
And age restricted. A lot of
Right.
towns have specific bylaws that govern age restricted.
We're hearing those aren't working as well.
I think it's market-based. There was a time when the market was booming. Then a couple of years ago, I heard developers saying that there was no market for it. Now I'm seeing a ton of applications for
It's starting to
over
come back
55 housing, so I think it's cyclical.
We saw a couple of them in the last 10 years, Jim, 2 or 3.
Yeah.
And I think we've had one try to come in and rescind it already. The one up on,
reselling's tough. I mean, I think a lot of people missed the market, thinking there was more of a demand.
Well, up
and
the
be
Avalon,
limited.
the Avalon's
one
one that.
person has to be, one of the owners has to be 55.
55.
So if you have a
Okay.
couple, I think it's 55.
What about street acceptance?
Mhm.
I mean, obviously, we go into this, we have no control if the town's gonna accept the street, right?
You
The
can make a
planning-
recommendation, and you would hope
Do
town
we-
meeting.
Is that how that works? Do we recommend that the street get accepted to town meeting?
If you want to make a recommendation, yeah, certainly. I mean, other divisions can comment whether they want to make a recommendation to town meeting as well, but yeah, ultimately lies with town.
I mean, a lot of times you'll see approvals that say the applicant agrees never to seek town meeting acceptance of the road. It shall remain forever private. It's really not enforceable because residents in a subdivision have the right to petition town meeting to accept a road. Obviously, it still requires the Board of Selectmen to lay it out, and it requires compliance with the approval. But if you're granting a lot of waivers, then I would think you may want to make a negative recommendation to town meeting.
Or the applicant knows they take that risk, right?
That's
It may
right.
not be accepted.
But the town has been doing it, we do it every year at town meeting, because the town gets chapter 90 money for however many miles they have of roadway, so the town is really, at least Danvers has done it a lot in the
Yeah.
last several years.
We have a lot of ways that were unaccepted that have been treated like public ways, so they're plowing them, they're filling potholes, they're doing everything. So
Trash.
rather than just not get the chapter 90 funding for that,
Right.
they've been accepting them, but that's for older ways.
Well, the newer ones too, you see them at the.
We've
town
approved a
meeting.
few that
Yeah.
the size of the roads aren't big. We just did one recently.
Yeah.
The road size wasn't big enough for a recommendation for it to be accepted. And we approved it with the idea that it was gonna stay a private road. Everybody on the board was here for it. It was 2 months ago, 3 months ago we did it. So,
Yeah.
we may need to consider that a little bit more strongly in the future. If the town engineer is gonna recommend that we always wanna try and make every road of a
Acceptable.
subdivision acceptable, then we may have to hold to our guns a little bit more.
Chapter 90 funds, generally cover the cost of routine maintenance, but then if you start having to, when the useful life of the road comes around, sometimes it doesn't always pay for itself also, especially, if there was a waiver in terms of the construction standards of the road.
Is the town still required I don't know if this is a question that you would know, but is the town still required to take care of the roads that were not conveyed to them?
No. In fact, the town's not allowed to use public resources to construct or do certain types of repairs to private roads. There's a local option statute that allows for plowing of private roads and for like emergency repairs of private roads. But in general, the town's not supposed to be, unless there's special legislation, and I don't know if the town has a home rule act that allows for it. A lot of times you see towns doing routine maintenance and reconstructing, resurfacing private roads, and they're really not supposed to.
Should we have something when we approve a road that's not gonna be conveyed due to its size? Should we have in our approval something written that at least states that the risk of any road upkeep is to the owners of the, at
Yeah,
least
I mean-
something so that they're aware of what they're getting themselves into?
Yeah, you could word it,
Or I think the
you could
developers
word it,
would know that.
your waiver as along the lines of the planning board grants this waiver, but it's based on the understanding that it would not recommend town meeting acceptance of the road as a public way or something along those
Right.
lines.
And they have to pay for lighting the road too. The developer would pay for that.
Right.
And then they form an association and they pay for it if
And
it's
they'd
not
have to
being
be,
accepted.
they'd be responsible for any repairs on those,
Yep,
on that road.
streetlights. You know,
I'm just thinking,
Sure,
and
the
it's,
roadway.
it's not,
It
it's not a
happens.
one-for-one, but like the WUMP fees and stuff that we have, that we constantly keep reminding people of, it's a similar situation, that, look, if, this is a responsibility, if you're not gonna follow the guidelines of what the town is looking for. It's having something stated in there. Just as a blanket statement, not necessarily you have to read it every time, but just remind.
The other thing is a lot of
Remind
times
them.
bus contracts, trash hauling contracts, they may or may not cover private ways. The town may not want to,
Similar to a condo association.
yeah, so especially if you have a narrow dead-end road where you waive the cul-de-sac requirement or something,
Well, that's constantly the battle of what we're doing now.
right?
Given the lack of land in town, most of what we have are dead-end turnarounds that are coming in front of us for anywhere from 3 to 8 single-family homes
Mhm.
in any of the lots that are left that are big enough. Just because all the roads have already been kind of accessed.
So what's the enforcement? If you have a commercial property that has access, it's a private way into the commercial establishment, and most people would know that they're driving on a private road, going into a mall,
Mhm.
use the malls as an example, and we have one. And the maintenance hasn't been that great. Who enforces that? Is that to say that, hey, you got a private way that the public's using that is a potential hazard?
Well, they can get sued for one, but that's not enforcement. If we're talking about a commercial subdivision road, and there's a condition of approval presumably that,
Going way, way back.
yeah,
right?
so hopefully there's a condition of approval that requires them to maintain it,
Yeah.
then you could initiate a subdivision enforcement action under section 81Y. Bear in mind, there's a 1-year statute of limitations on that, which courts are, in my experience, pretty lax about because they sort of treat it as a rolling 1 year from the violation. But you don't want to rely on that if you don't have to. So when you realize there's a violation, then you want to try to get them to the table. But if someone has a private road and people are transacting private business on it, it's really not the town's responsibility at that point.
So everyone is aware that that particular ring road is slated for repaving, I've been told, quite
That's
recently.
good. I mean, it came up in town meeting. We had
Yeah.
town meeting members
Oh,
thinking
yeah.
it was a public way,
Drive around every
saying,
day.
why don't we take some of the money?
By the property owner.
They,
It's a local mall, yeah.
yeah, the-
So they're going to repave it, not the town.
they're gonna repave it.
Yeah,
They're
there is their responsibility, yeah.
Yeah.
Jim and I will be very happy about that.
I'm sure you
Yes, very happy.
taking your front
Both
end.
our offices being in that area.
A lot of potholes, a lot of potholes.
Oh, my goodness. I'm only driving 50 feet on it, and I'm dodging like a dozen potholes just to get to my office.
It's ridiculous that they haven't done anything. Just
It's
a
been,
patch.
and it's been a long time,
It's a long time.
about 6 months now. But I think they're gonna group the whole thing.
That's good. I mean, that's a good example of, there's no way the public would know that that's a private way.
But it happens to be very, it's a heavily accessed road
Yeah.
by town. But almost everybody in town drives it
Yeah.
at some point in time. Everybody goes to the mall at some point in
Right.
time, even if it's just to get a cup of coffee.
Right. This has been a great discussion.
Yeah, I thought it was excellent.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
yeah, thanks for coming.
And,
What's this
Yeah.
case that you gave us, John?
oh, yeah, thanks for reminding me. So this is a case that just came down. And it's just sort of interesting. It's not something that's going to come up every day. But it's interesting because this is a case where the Supreme Judicial Court said that a property owner who could have come in and sought A&R endorsement was not required to. That if you can divide land and you can prepare a plan and get the land court or the registry to accept it without an A&R endorsement, the fact that you didn't get A&R endorsement does not entitle the building inspector to deny a building permit for one of the new lots, even though it's not shown on an A&R plan. And the facts here are sort of specific to the Brockton zoning ordinance in terms of, you know, when the lot was first created, if it was lawful under the zoning ordinance at the time. But separate from that is this sort of new notion that in Chapter 41, Section 81P, which is the A&R section, it uses this term, a property owner who's dividing land that doesn't show a subdivision may seek endorsement of that plan as not requiring subdivision approval. And the court said that's not mandatory. That's not the only way you can create this division of land. And so you can envision other circumstances where someone maybe you go in and you get a frontage variance, you have adequate linear frontage, but not on the type of road that the zoning bylaw would recognize as frontage. Maybe it's a way in existence and your subdivision bylaw says that frontage has to be a subdivision road or a public way. I don't know, but a lot of bylaws do. If you have sufficient linear frontage on that way, but you get a zoning variance to allow that frontage to qualify even though it's on a private way, and then you come in and apply for a building permit for that new lot, even if you haven't sought A&R endorsement, then I think what this case says is that you'd be entitled to that. So it's a recent decision, just came down, it's sort of interesting, so I thought, hey, I didn't have time to add it to the PowerPoint, so if there were any questions about that, I thought I'd just let you know about it.
So you're recording a plan, but it hasn't been stamped by the town?
Exactly, yeah. And I'm sure there are other instances where this sort of thing could come up. So. Great. Any other questions? All right, well, have a great night. Good luck with your A&R plans.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, we told everybody 8:30, so why don't
Yes, we are
give
a little
a
early.
couple of minutes. We'll give a short recess just to give us a break and allow everybody to, all the applicants to come in and get ready in a timely fashion.
You're gonna fill this out, Bill?
That would be, I guess we advertise,
We should at least open it,
yeah,
just so.
just so everybody
Right.
knows. Yeah.
All right, welcome back. So we're going to start with, continue with our other matters. We have 56 Adams Street and 75 Sylvan Street. Do we have a representative to present for that?
I can recuse on this one.
Okay. Jim Sears is recusing himself. Anyone here from Adams and Sylvan Street to present? Oh, yeah,
I'm here.
sorry.
Good evening, my name is Scott Cameron with the Moore and Cameron Group, 66 Elm Street in Danvers, Massachusetts. I'm here on behalf of 56 Adams Street LLC, who's the applicant. I presume you have the plan, you've seen the plan. I do have a hard copy here if you'd like to take a look at this as well. It's an A&R plan. What we're asking you to do is endorse it as not requiring approval under the subdivision control law. What this plan is proposing to do is to cut an approximate 1,746 square feet portion off of 75 Sylvan Street, which is over a 15-acre parcel, and that will be combined with 56 Adams Street to get to an aggregate lot area of just over 15,000 square feet. Of course, this is identified as a parcel, so it's not a buildable lot. And the intention would be to combine it with 56 Adams, which has frontage on Adams Street. That's it. Pretty
Okay.
straightforward.
I'm going to open up to the board. John, do you have any questions about the parcel A,
I do not.
A&R?
No, thank you.
Charles?
Forgetting everything we just learned. No, I don't have any questions or comments.
Nathaniel?
No, I don't have any, thank you.
I don't have any, so we're really just looking for, do we need a certificate or?
Just a vote to endorse.
Okay. I'm looking for a motion to endorse the approval of the A&R for 56 Adams Street and, what is it, 75 Sylvan Street.
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? All set? Does Jim need to stay out for the next one, too?
I don't believe so. I should go, I can grab him. Oh, Francine's on it?
Thank you, Francine. So, next we have a public hearing for 19 and 21 Bridal Spur. We were just given a request for a continuance, but I need to open the public hearing so we can continue on from there. Just read off of this.
I can.
If you have one, I'll
Yep.
read it.
Give me 1 minute.
Thank you. Notice is hereby given that the Danvers Planning Board will hold a public hearing in the Toomey Hearing Room, 1 Sylvan Street, Danvers, on Tuesday, June 11th, 2019, at 7 p.m. on a request for a special permit submitted by Daniel Lemieux and Deborah Lemieux, the owners of 21 Bridal Spur, Assessors Map 001, Lot 001F, to allow driveway access across 19 Bridal Spur Road, Assessors Map 001, Lot 001G. This will allow direct driveway access for the residential and emergency vehicles. Copies of the application and plans are on file and available for public review in the Land Use and Community Development Department at Danvers Town Hall. Ms. McCann has presented the board with a request for a continuance to, I believe, our next meeting, actually, the meeting of the 9th, July 9th, so 2 meetings from now. So I'm looking for a motion to continue. Did you want to present something quick?
Add to that date came from the planning staff memo.
Okay.
If you have the ability to put this on your next meeting of the 26th, that's okay too. The applicant wasn't requesting that long
Okay.
extension, so that's.
Do you feel you'll be able to present in the next meeting?
I think we will
Okay.
definitely know at the next meeting.
Then we're looking for a continuance to, I don't have my calendar in front of me,
June 25th.
June 25th, and the action date should be fine. Do I have a motion?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Next, we have continued public hearing for 197 Newbury Street. Nelson Mendoza.
2 minutes? Well, let us get set.
No problem. We'll give you a moment.
Thank you.
That's funny. As we said, we didn't do it.
Yeah,
What a coincidence.
yeah.
It's always funny how stuff like that is.
Sure. We can pass that around, yeah.
Yeah. We've got a Mylar that needs to be signed, I guess.
I can't sign that one.
Just remember, Peg's not here.
Right, we should still be.
Was this a special permit?
Nope, just the A&R.
Your signature. And she's gonna have to hunt Peg down.
Yeah.
Need another minute? We can go another minute or two. We did kind of cruise a little faster than we expected.
We did.
Yeah, he was kind
Yeah, Jonathan was very efficient and,
of, he was very good.
I have a question. I wasn't at the meeting, the last meeting, when you talked about the Subaru dealership. Did they come in front of us? They present?
They did,
They did?
and half of Old Salem Village.
No, I understand that. So,
oh, yeah.
so in order for me to be able to vote, I would have to watch the, is that something
we can make that
you
happen.
can
We
arrange?
believe we have the, footage.
Okay, great,
It's on the DCAT.
okay. I
Yeah,
don't,
you'll want to watch it.
no, I know, I have to watch it in
Yeah,
order to
Yeah,
vote.
no, it's, you'll need to know what you're getting into.
Yeah, so,
Yeah, we'll send you everything.
can you send me the
Yeah.
clip? That'd be great. Thank you.
Well, we've got,
Do you want to do number
I was just
five?
gonna say, does the applicant have a problem if we take something out of order briefly while, are you involved also, or are you gonna wait? We'll wait for it to come back. We just have a couple other quick other matters. We can do that while we're waiting for,
We can do the briefing.
yeah. Does that include the review, request for peer review, or
No,
not?
we can do that too. It's up
Well,
to you.
she represents the applicant on that one.
Oh, the request for the peer review?
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, I don't know, well,
That's staff requesting it of the board though, so we can.
yeah, I was gonna say.
all right.
However you
Oh,
want.
looks like she's ready now.
All right.
Found it.
Okay.
Okay,
Whenever you're ready.
great. Thank you very much. My name is Nancy McCann. I'm here on behalf of the applicant, Nelson Mendoza, and the Happy Canine. Nelson is here this evening. And we had presented to you back a couple of months ago an application for a special permit and site plan approval for the property located at 197 Newbury Street, which is a newly under construction, commercial building. And the Happy Canine would occupy one of the 3 tenant spaces in that existing building. And we were requesting a modification of that site plan as well as the dog daycare special permit. We made a full presentation at that time, which included discussing the layout of the site and the building, and the location of one tenant space that would be occupied by Happy Canine, consisting of 1,680 square feet, and the enclosure of a yard area. The site plan approval for this site was approved originally by the board, and it included development up to this point. And what this application includes is the special permit for occupancy for a dog daycare of one of the previously approved tenant spaces, and then from here back, an enclosure of that outdoor space. So we're talking about occupancy for a doggy daycare of a previously approved tenant space, and then the enclosure area for the outdoor play area. That involves the construction of a small 12 by 30 shed and enclosure with fencing, and we're proposing an 8-foot-high vinyl stockade fence around the dog enclosure area. We went through, I believe for you at that time, the operation, the hours of operation, number of employees, 4 full-time, 1 or 2 part-time employees, and the issue at the end of the meeting revolved around the engineering department's question about how waste would be handled, particularly liquid waste, from the dogs in the dog daycare outdoor enclosure area. Solid waste is going to be picked up immediately and removed from the site by a company that does that sort of thing. And then there was a request by the engineering department to either install a sewer system of some sort or to address the liquid waste in this area and what would happen to that. So, since the last meeting, we've been addressing that concern. And what you have is the submission of a narrative prepared by the Maureen Cameron Group, Scott Cameron, who's here tonight, addressing what has been developed to address that issue. And the plan also incorporates a couple of the other notes that the engineering department had wanted, the dumpster note and removal of electric service to the shed, which is not going to have electric service, and some minor notes. So at the end of the meeting, we really had to make some of those minor note changes. We had to address the waste issue, which we believe we have done. And then there was a request for exactly what the shed would look like. And this is that graphic. It is very similar to what we had previously submitted, but we wanted to provide you with exactly what the shed would look like. And that shed is going to be utilized for storage of equipment, food bags, cleanup materials, and things like that. So, I think what I would like to do at this point is to have Scott walk you through what he came up with and what is described in his letter, which was submitted to the board, with what changes that were noted on the plan, and then what he has come up with for the dog waste issue to address that. And then I'd like to go through with you the comments that we had received yesterday morning on this project, and we'll see where we are.
Nancy, good evening. For the record, Scott Cameron with the Moore and Cameron Group, 66 Elm Street in Danvers, Massachusetts. Nelson and Nancy contacted me following the last meeting to assist with the, I guess, the waste management component of the enclosed play area. I have, being introduced to the Danvers Dog Park with my first dog park, have learned a lot in that process. But since then, we have designed, permitted, and built 2 other dog parks, have another one under design development now. That you built one's Burlington, Bill Ricca. We're just starting another one in Auburn, and we've consulted on various other dog parks and have developed a little niche in this industry, going back to the Danvers Dog Park. So, safe to say, we've got a lot of experience dealing with these types of enclosures and what to expect when dogs are let to run around in there. So the first thing I did is I did schedule a meeting, and I met with Steve King, the town engineer, to talk to him directly about his concerns about managing the pet waste. The concern came mainly from an adjacent resource area that runs parallel with the property here, and the fact that the highway, revetment, construction, everything kind of slopes down towards that here from Route 1 to 95. And what happens when there's pet waste, urine in particular, the liquid waste in this area, and then that can potentially flow off the site. So a couple things, obviously, depending on the intensity of use for this area. If we're talking about a public dog park, we're usually anticipating a much higher degree of use because it is open to the public. You're going to get peaks and ebbs depending on population density around the dog park and how many people are using it. You probably, if you've seen Danvers Dog Park, it's busy on a regular basis, daily basis. This being a private use, it's more controlled. The owners have control over how it's maintained, how it's used, how they clean up after the pets. So there's a lot more oversight with the private use as opposed to a public park, which can, they can post rules and enforce things, but it's a little more open as far as what can happen in there. So that's the first thing. So it's a privately used play area, so you have more control over what's going on. So with the matters of the actual pet waste, dogs are going to go. They're going to go where they want to go. They usually tend to find one spot, and then they kind of go in the same spot after that. But it's sporadic. You're going to have dogs coming in who are familiar with it. It's not like a yard. If anybody does have a dog where they usually go to the same spot in the yard and they kill the same spot of lawn every single time. These are more transient dogs, so they're visiting for a short period of time for training or whatever, and then they're gone. And so trying to identify a certain area where you can let the dogs go that's not plausible. It's not realistic. It's not going to happen. The dogs are going to go where they can go or where they want to go within the enclosed play area. So that ruled that out. The other matter with more of a closed connection to a sewer is this is open to the atmosphere. And we're legally not allowed to connect an open sewer into the sanitary sewer system. This is called inflow. It's stormwater, or the opportunity for stormwater or groundwater to get into the sewer collection system, which then has to go and get processed out at the sewage treatment plant, which is a big problem. We're spending millions and millions of dollars trying to remove stormwater. So whenever we find open drains like this, and they do exist, there are open drains that are connected to sewers, you're required to remove them. So we couldn't propose a new one here, so that's not plausible. So we're dealing with an open area and what we can do to manage that area. So we took several different approaches to this, and we pulled from our experience from other dog park projects, coupled with some statutes that kind of relate to this. And the first thing, we looked at, was kind of the concentration of flow, in a term I grew fond of when the 2008 Stormwater Management Handbook came out, which is a legal term, which Nancy would appreciate. It's called de minimis. So basically means it's a very small amount of waste relative to the footprint of the area and relative to what, a rain event coming onto that would do. It kind of gets into the dilution is the solution type of mindset, but we're not talking about a concentrated flow where there's continually running pet waste coming out of this area. It's sporadic, it's spread out, and with regular either washing, because there's a spigot connection here to spray down the area to keep that down, or just your regular rain events. That will get diluted and go into the soil media. And how do we keep it in there? So we don't have water coming down off the embankment for the highway across this and down. So what we did with this exhibit, we overlaid the design of the play area on top of the Eastern Land Survey plan. And first off is an area of pavement over a portion of this, about half of it, that we would like to see removed, because that would be an impervious surface where water would just flush right off of it. So we proposed to remove that. And then we proposed to level this area. It's not, if you stand out there, it doesn't look steep, but there's 8%, 6% grades out there. Flatten this to about a 3.3% grade, so it's not as drastic coming across. And then basically the way it would be constructed is you'd fill it with soil, you put a layer of geofabric down, and then you put a structural course similar to what you use for a driveway, subbase of compacted gravel that does allow water to drain through, and then a pea stone finish on top of that, which is more palatable to the dog's paws. They still don't like it, but it's what's at the Danvers Dog Park. It's the most cost-effective balance between the optimum product, which is a product called rice stone, and not available and runs north of $100 a yard to purchase compared to pea stone, which is more around $25 a yard to purchase. It's a very reasonable solution. Other media for that finished material, sand, it harbors bacteria, doesn't clean as well. Dirt obviously is messy, stone dust gets stuck to the dogs and makes the dogs filthy, so you gotta wipe down their feet every time. So there's a lot of reasons why pea stone, I found, is one of the more preferred surfaces for this area. And it's permeable, and it can be raked out and leveled and maintained relatively easy. So that's not all we did on this. We still have this matter of runoff coming from this area down across. We're trying to minimize any water coming, off-site area, so we're just dealing with what's coming on here. So what we designed was a trench drain along the high edge of the dog park. So any water coming down from here would come across and go over. This water is all going through and out to this area anyways. We're not changing that. So even though we're running it through the underground system, so we don't have a point discharge somewhere, all this water is going down here anyways, and we're not changing that surface material. In fact, we're removing asphalt, making it more permeable with this option, which is better for stormwater management. The other thing we did is we added a plastic barrier on the lower edge of it. So if you look at the cross section as the water would come across, you're intercepting it here. And if there's any groundwater or water that's draining through, it's coming across, so it would hit that plastic barrier, which is buried underground, and that would force the water to go deeper into the soil, and that's where the soil does its thing. That's where nature treats anything that's going through that soil media. That's how septic systems work. Danvers isn't a septic system community, but there are some in town, here and there. But septic systems work with the native soil below the system. So by forcing that to go down into the soil, we're ensuring it's getting deep. We're also ensuring, and I measured out, we'll have at least a 3-to-1 slope coming off of that area with at least 15 feet of distance between the bottom of that plastic barrier and that slope. And that's going to prevent any concerns about that coming into the soil and maybe breaking out again. So we're driving that down. We're allowing plenty of depth, 4 feet or so, for the water to permeate through the soil and treat the runoff. This has been really effective. We did a similar thing at the Danvers Dog Park. We didn't put the plastic barrier on the low side because the slope wasn't as drastic. It wasn't a need to, but we did put the trench drain at the top end of it to catch any water that was coming down off the hill and just reroute that around the play area, so we didn't have to deal with that. So that's that's really the main reason why we're brought on to look at that area. We did make some other adjustments, or some comments to clarify where the dumpster would be located, so we added a note on top of the plan there, and just some cleanup, removing where the site is built out, and they're still showing proposed labels, so just some maintenance on the plan, just to clarify what's built. On this plan, the red is what we're proposing on this submittal, so that differentiated between what was submitted previously by Eastern Land Survey. That's what I have.
All right.
Any questions on that system?
I'll put it out to the board. Jim?
I'm fine with it. It seems pretty reasonable, other than doggy depends. I'm not sure what else you could do. I mean, it's, I think you're cleaning up the concern.
John?
No, I don't have a question. I thought it was a good presentation.
Charles?
Satisfied?
Nathaniel?
I think it was good. It was very interesting. That plastic barrier was something I'd never heard of. Very interesting.
I do know that there were a couple other concerns along the way. One of which I do remember in particular was about the fencing and prevention of making sure that the dogs aren't able to make their way up with these, I guess they have
Actually,
a...
if you don't
Oh,
mind.
go right ahead.
Sir, sure. So, just reviewing the presentation and going over the memo that I gave to you all earlier, regardless of what the engineering division has said, who doesn't staff this board actually, the planning staff had 15 different comments under other comments, most of which were from the original filing of the plan. Particularly, there's no test pits or any soil information for what's underneath the 11,000 square foot dog waste reservoir that's going in. That was my initial concern. I've got nothing back from engineering. Whether or not Scott's met with Steve, I have no idea. So that's planning staff's concern of where we're at, that, and also the scantness of the filing. I mean, it's a 9-sheet filing. We have this one. So just throwing that out there. The board's free to do whatever they want with it, but there it is.
Does the board have any particular issues with what staff's brought up?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for one member, I mean, it's always helpful to get a positive recommendation from staff, so comments on the disconnect from the applicant's standpoint?
I'd like to go through the comments that we
Okay.
received yesterday, and I think it would be helpful to go through them one by one. The first comment on the first page has to do with, I think as David just referred to it as the scantness. We discussed this, I believe, with the board at our initial presentation, that we submitted a single or 2-sheet plan for the original submission on this. The original set had, for the entire site, was 9 sheets or whatever it was. This, we are not doing any changes to anything that was approved previously until you get to this part of the site, which was going to be open. And this is where we are proposing that it still be open and it simply be fenced in, and we were adding a shed. And we discussed this with the board, whether that would be adequate given the type of modification that we're proposing. We're making no changes to this section of the site, which was the subject of the original site plan application. And I believe I walked away from that meeting with the understanding that aside from or understanding the comments that were received, that this presentation with the single sheet was sufficient for this type of an application. And so that's what we have done, rather than require the regurgitation of plans that are not changing. And that was my understanding, was that the board indicated that this filing was sufficient with regard to the plan sets that were submitted. And I know that there's a reference here in the memo to providing something similar to Group 1. And I do have, and the Subaru dealership, I do have to take issue with this creation of a fenced-in area and a 30 by 20 shed is very different from an application for a Subaru dealership. And this applicant is very different, and this application is very different. And I went away from the meeting when we did discuss it that this would be sufficient. Moving on to the other comments, comment number 1 on the second page. The waste, we have addressed that. That's was what Scott Cameron's submission and his presentation was just about. Number 2, the water line installation. We can certainly accept that as a condition for the as-built plans for this site. You will recall that this site is still as-built, it's not completed yet. You're holding a bond, and there are as-built plans to come, and the water line can be inspected, which has to do with the overall development, not specific to this particular applicant. But that would be an appropriate condition for approval that we would have to meet with as-built plans. The amended stormwater report, that's not something that we can do until we know that what Scott has just presented is acceptable. So if that is deemed acceptable, then we can update the stormwater report. And based on what Scott has just indicated, I believe what that update is going to consist of is that the shed and the enclosure and the system as being proposed is not going to impact the stormwater report that was already prepared and approved for this site. And I believe there was, in fact, an operations and maintenance manual as part of that stormwater report. But we can update that report in the form of a letter, and we could take that as, that could be something we could take as a condition as well, now that we know, or when we know that that waste issue has been resolved. Item number 4, the board should condition any approval to note that the excess snow would be removed and disposed of off-site. That's fine, that would be a condition that we would take as approval, as is typical. Number 5 would be the individual sheets on the plan that I've just discussed that we would request, and I thought we had requested, and it had been deemed, at least initially, as appropriate. Number 6, the applicant should provide the expected number of trips per day from their van. We did that during our first meeting. There are 2 trips proposed in the morning and 2 trips in the afternoon. The circulation, we circulation pickup and drop-off number 7, we discussed that, I believe, in detail during the first meeting. We can certainly do that again if you would like us to do that. 80% of the clients will be coming via the van service that the applicant provides, and otherwise the clients will be coming in and they will be dropping off at the building here and picking up here as well. Clients do not bring their dogs back to this area. Dogs make their way to this area in the vans by the employees. Number 8, a condition should be placed on any approvals indicating that overnight boarding is prohibited. Absolutely, that was part of our application, and we would accept that condition. Number 9, elevations. I've just given you the elevations of the building. Number 10, exterior lighting. There is no exterior lighting proposed for the fenced-in area at the back. Should the applicant deem that outside lighting is needed at some point in the future after the operation is up and running, he would have to come back to the board if he wanted any outdoor lighting, but he doesn't see that need at this point in time. I believe item number 11 was already dealt with as far as discrepancies in the prior plan. As Scott mentioned, he took care of those items as shown in red. Number 12, an invert listed. I don't know, I think perhaps that's an old comment. Item number 12, I'm not, if that's still outstanding,
11 and 12 are both still out.
those are both still outstanding. Okay, we can address 11 and 12 if those are still outstanding. Number 13, the internal fencing is movable. They are interior partitions, so we don't believe that those should be or need to be shown on the plan because those are movable areas that Nelson will use to segregate the dogs appropriately as needed. Number 14 is, again, the stormwater question that we've already discussed, which we can update. And the same is true of item number 15. And then we go on to page 3. These, I believe, are old comments from the engineering department. Number 1 is satisfied, we believe, as part of the submission that Scott has provided. Number 2 would be shown on the as-built plan. Number 3, again, this is an old condition that I think is addressed by Scott's submission, and any additional items that would need to be included in the updated stormwater report. And final paving has not been done, so we don't need a pavement restoration detail yet. As I said, this property is currently under construction. So I think really where we're at is we've got just a couple of items related to the stormwater management report that we can update now that we have the plan in place for the liquid waste that Scott has developed and presented to you tonight, and he developed that in consultation with the engineering department. So,
But all the comments about stormwater aren't addressed now, and you're saying address them after we approve it. How do we know that it works?
well, I think you could do it one of 2 ways. You can require that we submit the updated stormwater report, which as I indicated, I think will be a letter simply indicating that what we're proposing meets the requirements and doesn't alter the original stormwater report. Or what I think could also be done is that you could approve this as a condition of approval, that we update the stormwater report prior to the issuance of any building permit or occupancy permit.
So just for what it's worth, staff has no issue with the tenanting of the building. I think it's great that the previous applicant found a tenant. The interior space is completely fine. The question is, it's an 11,000 square foot dog play yard, which is larger than most single-family house lots in Danvers. No test pits have done, and there's no idea of what soils are out there. So my question is, are you digging test pits before this happens? Are we going to get test pit soil samples in a letter after the fact?
Scott, do you have any input on that before I give a layperson's answer?
I can certainly be on site to oversee the excavation. It's very similar to how we would install, frankly, a septic system, where you clear the surface, you scarify it, you make sure it's ready to receive the fill on top of it, and then the upper layers. We are filling, not cutting on this. So to an extent, the soil below doesn't matter, because the groundwater, if present, is going to be below that. And also being in the highway median, again, I haven't reviewed the test pits, but this has all been altered in the construction of the highways a long time ago. So I would expect there to be probably fill in this area. But again, happy to observe that excavation when they're prepping the bed.
No, I get that, but just so the board's aware, when a septic system goes in, it has to pass Title V. That's the difference that's going on right now.
Okay.
And I don't want to make it, this isn't a Title V system. We drew from principles of that. But when I mentioned that word de minimis, this isn't like we're designing for a flow per day. This is very sporadic, very light use compared to that. We designed a single-family house for a flow. This is nowhere near that. But we drew from those same principles because it's all similar science, if you will.
Yeah, totally fair. I just think engineering's original concern and planning staff's as well was that it's very close to Beaver Brook. When we get tested at Beaver Brook and there are spikes, what does that mean?
Okay.
So,
I'm going to let the board think about this for a minute. I'm going to come back to the board in a minute because this is a public hearing. I'm going to open up to the public briefly. Is there anyone from the public who has any questions, comments?
Stephanie and Joel Costa.
Please use the,
At the last presentation, Ms. McMahon had said that the fencing would not be on the property line between 199 and 197, and that there would be parking between 199 and 197, and then there would be the enclosed dog area. Is that still true?
I don't believe that the parking is involved with this, but I'll let Ms. McCann answer that.
I'm not concerned about the parking, I'm concerned about the location of the fencing of the dog area, if it's on the property line.
No, it's in from the property line, maybe Scott can tell me how far.
About 8
in.
feet.
It's about 8 feet in from the property line.
8 feet, so there is no parking between the property line, parking, and the fenced area. It's just 8 feet in between.
That's, I believe that's correct. There was never proposed to be parking for,
That's the lot line,
Yes.
and
This
that's,
is one
and
ninety.
that, see the line with the X's?
Okay, at the last meeting, you had said there would be parking here, and then
No.
this would be, well, let's
The park-
review the notes.
okay, we should.
This is
because-
parking of 197.
Correct.
199.
That's correct.
Right. My concern is my clients park here to go to my facility. Their dogs are coming out here, your fenced-in area is here. We're gonna get dog reactivity. That was my first concern. The second concern was the fencing, and would the dogs be able to get over the fencing? I brought up the fact that we needed some sort of barrier, whether it be electronic or coyote barriers, because fencing, whether it be vinyl or wood, has crossbars. That's a launching point for dogs.
For 199, they park right up against the lot line. There is no buffer.
Okay.
Right.
They park to their lot line. We have about an 8-foot buffer between
Okay.
our lot line and our 8-foot-high stockade fence.
I thought it was vinyl.
It's a
It's a
vinyl
vinyl
stockade fence. And this is an area that is going to be, dogs will never be out here by themselves. They are monitored, they are with staff in limited numbers out here, and Nelson can address that. But that's what the proposal is. The proposal was never having parking here.
And for what it's worth, I did check with the Board of Health staff on the coyote rollers. If the fence is 8 feet high, I understand there's extreme circumstances that we talked about last time where dogs could maybe get the top paws up on that, but I think in your average dog, in your average circumstance, that they did not feel it was warranted.
Okay, with
Just so the
that,
board's aware.
if there's any problems in the future, is that something that Board of Health would have to address? It's hard to predict.
If the
I'm
dog
not,
got out. and-
I mean, I'm not a dog person, so I can't speak to different types of dogs and,
All I can say is really that I didn't think it would be an issue.
okay, all right.
Depends on the size of the dog.
I know, and I understand that.
Okay.
I just thinking,
Your dogs are trained.
Oh, please, we're trying not to have
Yeah.
conversation between different people at the same time. Everything has to come through the board, okay? Did you have any other comments, questions?
My concern is the fencing and the dogs going over the fence, and my clients coming into my facility and parking there, and he having his clients out into the dog area. There's going to be reactivity. I don't, my dogs are never off leash anywhere in the parking lot. There's going to be dog reactivity, dogs are gonna react, they're gonna be trying to get their dogs from that parking space to my location at 199. I have a concern about that, and how are they gonna keep their dogs from barking and reacting with my dogs?
What effect does that have on the dogs?
It affects the handler of the dog. If you're trying to walk a dog from the car to my facility, and they hear other dogs barking and training, they're gonna be tougher to control.
Wouldn't they see other dogs entering your facility at the same time?
I'm sorry?
Wouldn't they see other dogs if they all go at 8 o'clock in the
That has
morning?
nothing to do with seeing, it's hearing, smelling, reactivity. Dogs
But if they're
walking
getting
like-
out of the car and someone next to them has a dog,
I'm sorry?
I'm missing the point, I guess.
The point is, my clients come in and park there to walk their dogs into my
Right,
facility.
but aren't there other dogs coming out of the same parking lot, walking in? Wouldn't they see other dogs? How is that
These dogs are gonna be loose running around
not
in an
near?
area.
But they're fenced in with an 8-foot
I
fence.
understand that, but there's still gonna be higher activity, higher elevations. That's gonna cause my dogs to react.
And, okay. So how are you damaged?
My
I'm trying to
clients are gonna
understand
have a tough
what the
time
effect
getting
of
their
that is on
dogs
your
from the
business.
parking lot into my facility.
Right. What's the effect on your clients? They're not gonna go to you now because they hear another dog barking? I'm not getting it.
Yeah, they're not gonna come to me because their dogs are gonna be reacting to other dogs loose in that
But aren't they
area.
being trained some sort?
My dogs, I'm a daycare, boarding, and
Right.
training center. Some of my clients are not there for training, they're there for boarding and daycare.
But if 3 people showed up at 8 o'clock to drop their dogs off, wouldn't they see those other dogs and react?
Yes. But
So
those
what's the
dogs are on
difference
leashes.
between,
Those dogs are not
what's the
on leashes.
difference between that reaction and them hearing another dog nearby?
Because those dogs are running loose and are more highly elevated. My dogs are on leashes, they're controlled, they're walking in. Those dogs are gonna be running around, barking and doing whatever they do and playing. That's gonna
Okay.
cause my dogs on leashes to react.
Okay. So you're gonna experience a loss in business because of that, you're telling us?
Yes, I could.
All right.
So they shouldn't have an opportunity to build their site because of that? Is that your argument?
I shouldn't have an opportunity to do
They
business?
shouldn't. They shouldn't have an opportunity to have a competing business next door?
No, they should come up with a plan to prevent their dogs from reacting and affecting my dogs.
And the solution of that could be the dogs being on leashes, is that what you, I mean, I remember the conversation. I mean,
The,
this gets into
That-
dog
the
behavior.
solution of that is at the location of the outdoor area. It's too close to the property line. That's one issue.
How do we know
8-foot
that, how do we
buffer,
know
though,
their
is-
dog's gonna be out at the same time your dog's gonna be out? Do we have matching schedules?
My dogs come in and all, I'm open from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m.
Right.
My dogs come in and out at all different hours. At some point, they're gonna be out there and he's gonna be training or doing daycare or whatever.
Okay.
And there's gonna be barking and loud whatever activity and whatever.
And that's gonna affect your business?
Yeah,
Have you got any quantification of that, how it might affect your business?
I could lose, if people are having difficulty walking into my business with their dog, they'll go elsewhere where there isn't outdoor areas and dogs running loose and with high activity.
I think I'm a little confused. Huh? The only thing that I'm confused by is the other dog, the kennel, I don't want to call it a kennel, I apologize. The doggy daycare or the drop-off and pickup, are they going to be walking the dogs within that 8-foot range?
Absolutely not.
They're inside.
Our customers coming here, that's where they drop off their
Right.
dogs. You will remember that the dogs get from here into this area by
Right.
van that
So-
we drive. So our dogs are going to be in an 8-foot-high, solid, enclosed, fenced area, monitored with employees at all times. We have a parking area that seems to be of concern that's right up against the lot line. We have an 8-foot buffer. But there is also, these parking spaces are probably a good 80 feet from the building. There is a large parking area between these parking spaces. You've got at least a row of parking here. You've got 2 lanes, at least 24-foot aisle lanes. And then you've got, there may even be another lane of parking in between, and then you've got the building. So these, if anyone were to park here to get their dog in, that may happen. I'm not going to dispute that, but there is a good 80-foot distance or better to the lot line to this building, and then we've got an 8-foot buffer, and then we have a fence.
Okay.
I understand a concern about business competition. I get that. That is not the basis to deny a special permit.
So my other question about this is how many staff members are going to be in the, like, per dog? Is there a limitation? Like, how many dogs are going to be out there?
Yeah, we're
with-
looking between, we want to keep low ratios. Most acres usually do are 15, 20 to 1 person, so we want to do about 6 to 1 person.
6 to 1?
6 to 7, yeah.
So if you have 12 dogs out there, you'll have 2 staff, minimum of 2 staff members out
Yeah,
there.
of course. That's just,
Okay.
even if we have less, we would still have 2.
And how long are the dogs going to be out there?
It's gonna be there's gonna be rotation from indoor to outdoor. So when you get really hot days, we'll go in indoor, cool off with the AC, and kind of have more indoor space play, and rotate from groups to groups. So it's not gonna be all of them all at once, outdoor, all of them at once. Indoor is gonna be divided into staff. So like 2 or 3 people will have their one group, 2 or 3 people will have their other group, and just rotate.
I think the matter before the board, just to consider to bring it back to the regs, is this site an appropriate use for what they're asking for? I think that's how all of this would relate to part of the decision that you'd be crafting, not now.
Right,
Just at some point in the
right,
in the
right.
future.
Right. Okay. I think I understand it a little bit better now, okay. Did you have any other comments about it?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I know at least one or two of the bays are rented out to car repair, not car repair, race car development, race car maintenance, motorcycles and whatnot. And I know for a fact right now that there is the driveway, which is asphalt, and then there's lint pack that was put down specifically for these businesses. And one of the business owners told me that it was put down to absorb the toxic oils and whatever from the cars. I've got pictures, but there's a strip of where all these car trailers and motorcycles and race cars all park along this area. So I'm assuming Mr. Mendoza would have a little driveway or something to get to the back of this area. My concern is, and we have problems with it now, when they're out testing those cars and they're revving it up, it sounds like a jet engine. It elevates dogs like you wouldn't believe. And I'm indoors. It's very loud. If these dogs are going to be outside in that area, right next to where they're running these cars, how is he going to be, number one, be able to control them, number two, prevent them from elevating?
Okay. This applicant's not responsible for the revving of the cars,
No, I understand that.
but we can obviously,
He's responsible for the behavior of the dog.
there are limitations in terms of noise that businesses can create, so that is something that we can look in. Is it something we can mention to the building inspector?
If they're
Okay.
violating an ordinance, which I don't believe we actually have an ordinance,
Yeah.
but we
No,
can bring
you
it
don't.
up. Yeah.
Okay. But we can bring it up to the building inspector.
I'm not I'm just worried about, I mean, it's not consistent, but when they do it, the dogs elevate. And he's gonna have dogs outside, loose in an area.
I didn't know what you were writing.
Oh, sorry, no, I was just taking
Just
notes.
making you notes about
Yeah,
it?
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
all
sorry.
right, okay.
No, you're waiting.
I thought you wanted to mention something.
No, no, go
Okay. All right, we'll bring it up to the building inspector, but in terms of businesses, there's only so much we can do. Mr. Mendoza is gonna be responsible to make sure that his dogs are kept under control, and if that requires talking to other people within the confines of his own business, is it okay if he's looking to rate, he wants to talk?
Sure.
Okay.
So, I mean, so we have a very strict, we would have a very strict evaluation process. So not just anyone that just comes in will be able to come and disrupt that. There are a lot of unruly dogs, for sure. And a lot of new daycares do take them for whatever reason, and that creates a very stressful environment. We are reason people liked us in the past was because we were very quiet and very structured, and we kept very, very little noise. I think that was just the way that I was trained from my mentors, and to keep a very structured environment, so they're not barking at every little thing or like your average daycare would. So I think because we're taking on specific dogs that we know aren't going to become an issue or aren't huge barkers, that helps bring down a lot of this question, yes.
Okay, so you're aware of the fact that there's gonna be some engines?
Yeah, I'm not concerned about it at all.
Okay.
Are there barking collars the dogs have if they're disruptive?
No, we don't use bark calls, but I mean.
Earplugs? I mean, I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, you do have two highways
sure. I mean, they don't really
right there
mind it.
with
Once they
trucks
start
going
playing,
by.
It's fun, you know?
Right.
It's not much about, I mean, we're looking at it, like you mentioned, it's between two highways, so like, driving, that's.
Trucks going by all the time.
Yeah, that's natural, whether we stop rush or not, there's
Commuting.
trucks and motorcycles drive by right next, so there's actually, I think some traffic on this police station next door a couple days ago, and it was like 100 motorcycles there. So, that's not a concern for us.
Did you have any other comments or questions about,
One last comment, his space is 1,680 square feet, and he's proposing that he drive inside to drop off dogs, which is going to reduce the footprint of his daycare area. So I'd like to know what his maximum limit of dogs would be in daycare, in the inside of the facility.
I'll let you answer that question.
So yeah, we drive in, close the doors, unload, and then we drive the cars back out. So it's not like the cars stay inside at all times, they don't take up any space. And that's the reason we want the outdoor space, we can have that freedom where they can be indoors on those cold rainy days or snowy days, and we can also have them outdoors on the nice warm weather and enjoy fresh air. That's kind of my main concern.
So what is your maximum, what's your limit of dogs in daycare, inside the facility?
We haven't come up to a full number yet, just because we want to see the outdoor space more than anything and see how that goes. But we, like I said, we don't plan on having all the dogs, everyone's in daycare, all at once indoors, all at once outdoors. It's going to be rotated between two groups. So that will keep the numbers low as well, as much indoor as outdoor.
Is there a limitation according to town bylaws, or does
There are no rules.
Peter Morandi have anything?
That may be.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if there's health regulations regarding this. I think we actually discussed it at the last meeting.
For boarding facilities, I think there is.
We talked,
for
yeah, we talked about
kennels.
for kennels
For
and
kennels,
things.
yeah, not necessarily
That's
for
not what
daycare.
this is, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there, as far as you know, there's nothing, I don't think there's one, because we've
Certainly
dealt
not.
with other daycares and haven't put a limitation on it there
So
either.
there are no formal rules and laws. Everybody's going the honor system by ASPCA guidelines. And per those guidelines, it's 100 square feet for large dogs and 75 square feet for small to medium dogs.
Okay.
So based on his area, 1680 square feet, that'll tell you how many dogs, large dogs he can handle. But if he's driving the van inside, that's gonna reduce his footprint. Because when you're driving a van inside, you're gonna have to contain the dogs that are in there, because you're gonna have to open the door to get the van back out.
But that doesn't take away from the square footage of the building itself.
So
And the
we can do
number- with the number.
16 large dogs, and maybe whatever, 24, 25 small to medium dogs.
And it's, you said, what kind of, right now, you don't have any staffing, you don't have any strict restrictions that you know you're gonna keep to. I don't think there is one in the towns.
There isn't a requirement in town. Nelson is aware of industry type of standards, but he's going to run a good facility. He's been in this business before, and he wants quality customers too. He wants his customers to be happy.
I have restrictions. I was told when I was approved by the zoning board that I had 5,000 square feet and I had to stay within ASPCA regulations and standards. And if I have those applied to me, I think they should also be applied to the meeting that.
Okay. Does the board have any comments about that?
That was a different board, it's not this board.
Yeah, and that's,
I'm not sure of the facts of her situation.
It's a
Hers
zone-
is an indoor place also.
and it's a zoning, that was zoning
ZBA.
relief with,
Right. She was getting probably a variance or something.
non-conforming,
Right, which this isn't.
right. Anyone else from the board have any particular comments about?
Well, I mean, I'm all for consistency. I mean, we are one town. I get it, we're two different boards, so I understand the point of view.
No? Okay. We'll take it under advisement at this point in time, okay?
Okay.
Yep. Anything else from the audience, questions? Mr. Bradstreet?
I had, Bill Bradstreet, town meeting member, precinct 1. I had 2 questions, and I know you'll tell me if I shouldn't be asking you. The comment was made there are no state standards for running this type of business. I thought that's what I heard. Am I wrong?
We were only commenting on that the town doesn't have any particular zoning laws associated with it. I'm not, like I said, I would have to defer to staff or to Peter Morandi if there's anything statewide associated with it.
I know there's, I'm sorry,
No,
go
that's
ahead.
it. I was just gonna say, as far as we can tell, after the last meeting, I recall speaking with both staff members for Board of Health, and the closest thing that we have are the ASPCA standards. We definitely don't have anything local, so,
It sounds like those are guidelines, though, as
They're
opposed to
in their
hardcore
guidelines.
rules.
yeah, they, well, right. As a body.
My thought is the state likes to run everything, put their fingers on if there's certainly money involved. There was an article in the paper about what happened at one daycare. Is that you or the ZBA that would require businesses to have proper insurance? Is that you?
That doesn't
I
go
can
through.
show you the article.
Yeah, no, insurance for any kind of business would be under the business's purview on its own. It's not actually, it would be required under certain state laws, but it wouldn't go through this board in particular, no.
So
From
Would
a
I be asking-
insurance standpoint.
would I be asking another board, or do I just
I'm not even sure that that's something that the town even takes care of. That's more of a, from one business to another, what's required for your licensing and for you to open up under the state laws. Because every type of business is gonna be a little bit different.
I guess my point was that dogs, although they breathe and what have you, they're considered property. If someone's property is damaged, then what does that require? Going to court for seeking redress?
You're getting outside of my purview in terms of what I know about this.
Again, I'm asking so you
Yeah.
can tell me
Yeah.
who I should be talking to.
My guess is I would probably go to, I would start with Peter Morandi, and he would be able to tell you where to go from there. He's the board of, the health, thank you, the public health board, and he'll probably be able to tell you where to go, which specific
To answer the
board you may
question.
have to talk to about the insurancing associated with it, but it might even be the same as ASPs.
Yeah, I think that's gonna be a private matter that doesn't fall under the town really at all.
I think it's probably going to be something a client might ask.
I would imagine that the state would have to take a look at his facility also. I mean, generally speaking, most businesses are looked at by the state because you have to register your business with the state anyways. So they're gonna have some kind of requirements associated with it. I know my business did.
Again, that's why I was asking the question.
Yeah,
It's an open forum, so anybody
absolutely.
who's watching this might have the same question or perhaps a proper
I'd love to
answer.
give you an answer, I just don't have one for that.
That's why I asked the question.
But it is a good question. I mean, the town does issue liquor licenses and license to operate cabs, and we have certain insurance requirements, right?
I don't know if it's through the town, though.
I think it is.
That's outside of my wheelhouse, but
Yeah.
you have to register a DBA with the town, I do know that, with the town clerk, but that doesn't necessarily require anybody from the clerk's office
Depending
to
on the
go out.
license, the state license, you may require
So it
malpractice
could-
insurance.
okay, so
if you're
maybe
gonna
it's
practice.
tying back to the state.
Professional liability insurance to keep your license. And you have to report to your
Most
licensing
insurance,
authority.
yeah. Most insurances are all done through the board, the licensing boards, which are all state-run.
Okay.
Even if they're locally approved, like a liquor license and things like that. I mean, this is getting way outside of what,
I know, what
what's
we
got to do
I
with
know,
this.
but
Anything else from the audience? Any other questions, comments? Okay. I'm going to bring it back to the board. Does the board have any comments? We've had a lot of feedback from a lot of different places, including staff. How does the board feel about moving forward and voting at this time?
I have a question.
Go right ahead.
I don't know how this, if this relates to number 9 on the planning staff's comments that, Nancy, you addressed. Elevations of the proposed structure, the shed.
Yes,
What are the dimensions of that shed?
it is 12 by 30.
12 by 30? Oh, how high is it?
It's a single story.
Like-
It's like 12 feet, maybe 15 to the peak.
16 on center.
Yeah.
16 on, no, that's the inches on the
Oh,
studs.
16 inch, I'm sorry. 4 by 6.
It may even tell me what it's like.
2 by 6.
I didn't see the dimensions, so I was just curious. I didn't know if that applied to, if that answered, if that's what the staff was asking for on number 9.
No, the staff was asking for.
We just didn't have this, no.
You didn't have the
We didn't have
picture,
this.
the elevation.
What does that mean by elevation?
This, what the building looks like.
Essentially,
looks
the
like.
building, yeah, plan.
Just
view
what it
from the
looks
side.
like?
Facade.
Elevation does not mean height?
No.
Right.
Oh, they-
Well, not in this
It
instance, yeah.
Okay,
There you go.
all right, thank you.
1 story versus 2 is really what they're looking for. That kind of- but there are quite a few things that both staff, engineering have also brought up.
So
I don't,
just-
go ahead.
Just for what it's worth, if you don't mind me jumping in, with regard to the decision, staff doesn't have anything prepared tonight and isn't prepared to go forward with that. If you'd like, you could close the public hearing, then the board has 90 days to make a decision. You don't necessarily have to close the public hearing, we can keep it open as well. So
Okay.
it's up to the will of the board.
So I'm gonna leave it out. Does the will of the board, do they feel like we've got enough information to proceed? It looks like the applicant is gonna have to
Well,
appease with a little bit more of what's going on from the town. At least from some verbiage.
I think it's unfortunate that there's no decision that's been crafted. I think this applicant has gone through a lot of hurdles for what is actually being proposed, when we're talking about a 12 by 30 shed. We've approved large commercial buildings in one meeting, and I know there's concern about the wetlands and so on, which I think are being addressed over and above, what we've seen in other applicants. I think the applicant, we could craft a decision, based upon stating and identifying the plans to approve it, subject to the conditions that were listed. Basically, the, dealing with those stormwater management issues, conditioned on that. To make him wait another 90 days, I think, is a little bit egregious.
We wouldn't be waiting the full 90 days, it's just, we have 90 days. Understand?
It's just interesting that a decision was not crafted. Normally, whenever we have a meeting, the decision is going to be prepared. I don't.
That's true. I guess there was just a number of outstanding items. I mean, even with regard to the comment about Group 1, I understand Group 1 is not Nelson. I get that. My problem is that the bylaw says this is a major modification with a special permit, which is actually even over and above what Group 1 is asking you for, which is a separate application.
But this is something that we just approved within the last year. This isn't
No,
something
I get it. It's
that's
just
come
at the
in
staff
front of
level.
us 10 years later that people aren't familiar with.
I understand.
We
just
went
at the
through this, this is the
Yep.
third time.
I
We're
don't
going through
think we need to,
a shed.
I don't want to see this turn into something else on the
Okay.
board right now,
Sure.
okay?
Yeah.
So, does the rest of the board have any, Jim, it sounds like Jim's ready to move forward. But we also have, this is 2 votes, because this is a major modification and it's a special permit. So everybody on the board on the special permit that's present will be voting on that, if we do vote on that today. Does anybody on the board have particular comments, questions about either what Jim said or moving forward? Because my next action is to close the public hearing and then to present to the board if they want to have a longer conversation or if we're going to make a motion.
I mean, I support closing the public hearing. I don't think I need anything more to hear from the public. But I am uncomfortable that staff wants a little bit more time to get this right. Now, we have to be efficient. I'm not a big proponent of dragging things out. I mean, can we get ready and be ready for the next meeting?
Sure. If the board wants a draft decision for the next meeting, we can do that.
Okay. So is there any particular comments that, from staff that we saw? There was quite a long list, and it's a bit of a discrepancy between the applicant and what staff is requesting in terms of, most of it does sound to me like boilerplate that should be able to be fixed.
Yeah.
Through either a different, some letters back and forth and some comments, maybe a slight change to the plan, but it seems to be a sticking point with some of the other people. I haven't heard from the rest of you guys.
I have nothing more to add.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm not particularly comfortable moving forward at this point, given staff's feelings, at least until, like, the test pits are dug or things like that. Like, I hate to be arbitrary, but I don't want to push something through in haste.
Well, my feeling with, this is my personal feeling with the test pits. Given that this is going to be rather shallow, I think that the test pits, not that they shouldn't be done, but that is something that if it doesn't meet certain requirements, I'm assuming it's going to come back. It would come back in front of engineering. They wouldn't be able to proceed if it doesn't meet the certain requirements that the engineering would require. In terms of what the soil should look like and whether or not it's porous enough. That's really what it comes down to. Because it is supposed to be, it is landfill that's coming in from, I think it's 95 is right there. That's my opinion, but I don't want to influence the rest of the board on that. Because some people would feel that's a little bit more important than others. So at least one thing, I'm going to look for a motion to close the public hearing at this point in time.
So moved.
Okay.
Second.
All those in favor of closing the public hearing?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay. So,
I mean,
If
it's
we-
oftentimes, we do vote things with conditions that those be approved. If for some reason the test pits came back and they didn't meet muster and they had to come back and deal with that, they wouldn't get a building permit. So that happens a lot, that we'll condition
Right.
the approval on something like that. Right now, this applicant has been in front of us several times for this use, and I don't have any interest in the applicant. I feel that, it feels like we've kind of singled out this applicant, and we approve multi-million-dollar buildings in one meeting. And this is a 30 by 12-foot shed. Granted, there are some dogs that are gonna go to the bathroom outside in the pervious surface, but I think we're going a little bit overboard. And I'm ready to, you know, if you want me to reference the plan and craft it, and we'll reference a vote if people are willing to do that. Otherwise, he has to incur, you know, just like any applicant, has to come back and incur a cost to come back every single time in front of the board. And this will be our third or fourth meeting on this, you know, applicant for a shed.
The public hearing's been closed.
Has it
Well-
been, has it been 3 hearings? I thought there was only 2, Jim, but you could be
This-
right.
It has been extended out. This is the second time in front of us, but regardless, it's
We
been
had
multiple times.
the original development.
Right.
I think that might have been one meeting.
Okay, okay.
So that, it's been more than one time. It's been multiple times he's been here.
mean,
I can see Jim's point in
I'm all
terms of. trying to do-
in favor of efficiency too. I mean, no one wants added expense. You
My,
know,
Jim, the only thing that makes me feel uncomfortable about voting this forward tonight is that it's a special permit on top of a modification, major modification.
I mean,
That's the only
what
thing that
upsets
gets
me is that, and I know, your staff, you just had a baby, and but usually, we only have 2 items on here that would require a decision.
That's-
So those are prepared and be ready to be read at every meeting. So they're not prepared, for whatever reason, I understand your personal
Jim,
issues
I
where you couldn't
think-
get to it, but I mean, but it's not, Bill, we're asking them to come back for a third time for a shed, and I think
I
that's out of
understand.
line.
Well, I understand.
That's my
but
opinion,
it's-
that's my opinion.
I understand your opinion. I agree with you in that case,
Right.
in that situation. I would like to proceed and vote for it too. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that we would have enough support on the board if we did that right now. That's the other problem, so.
We can pull the board.
Before we do that, just quickly, we could do a vote now, and that's okay. If it's okay with the board, I can craft the decision in conjunction with the chair and just get it submitted to the clerk. Because we'll have 14 days, so it'll be literally in 2 weeks, it'll be Thursday, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Could you explain that process a little more?
So if I'll let you do it. Go ahead.
No, I was just
Go
gonna say,
ahead,
if you want to take a vote tonight, which you totally can, so we close the public hearing, you can do a vote. We have to submit a decision to the town clerk within 14 days, so if it's okay to the board, if you vote and say staff will work with the chair to craft the decision, we can get that in 14 days.
Which would include the conditions associated with, that the applicant's already accepted, along with approval of not just staff, but also engineer. Okay?
Okay.
To create an efficiency and allow this to go forward. Does the rest of the board feel comfortable with that?
Yep.
Okay. Nathaniel? Yep.
Yeah,
Good?
that's fine.
Okay. So, I'm looking for a motion do we do the special permit first, or do we do the
I
mod?
do the special permit first.
Okay. So I'm looking for a motion on the special permit first. I'm looking at Jim.
Move to approve a special permit for a pet daycare and training facility under Table 1 of the zoning bylaw for 197 Newbury Street, located in the Highway Corridor District, as shown on plans attached and presented herewith.
Second.
I'm going to open any discussion associated with that right now. No? Okay. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Now we have the major modification on the floor.
Move to approve a major modification of the site plan approval under Section 4 for construction of a small shed-style building and enclosed fenced area associated with the pet daycare use, Assessors Map 24, lots 21B, for 197 Newbury Street.
Do you want
Writing conditions.
With
Are you-
standard,
to, we're
With the
going to open up
conditions
the
that you wanna
conditions
add.
associated between staff and
Yep,
the applicant and the chair?
correct.
Okay. Is that suitable?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
We're, yeah, that's my
Folding in
problem with
Folding
this.
in the conditions as addressed by the staff memo with the 3-page memo with the 14 items, I believe.
Well, I think we want to be specific. I think
That's the
updating
problem with
the-
it. This is associated with the applicant, not the public. The public hearing is closed.
Updating the stormwater report.
Yeah.
I think that covers the items that were not included here, that were not already covered, and those are, I think, number 1 and 11 and 12. So we would update the stormwater management report. I think you wanted to add in a condition that there would be no overnight boarding.
That was one.
And
No exterior lighting.
no exterior lighting. I think,
Everything else is standard.
Oh, hours of operation?
I didn't even see that on here.
So I have condition for snow storage, condition for lighting, condition on the stormwater, all of which we talked about.
Right, in which the applicant agreed to, right? I mean, so we can get that on the record, the ones that were, you already agreed to some of these, right? When you went through your petition, I mean,
The ones we were just talking about, yes.
right.
yes. Updating the water line, which was item number 2, we agreed to that. The snow storage, number 4, we agreed to that. Condition, no overnight boarding, which was number 8. No exterior lighting, that was number 10. And then the rest of the items, I believe, are covered.
The rest of them are,
With
More-
stormwater.
yeah,
Updating the stormwater report would hit all of
that's
the
between,
items.
updating, that both
that we would
engineer and,
submit that,
Yeah.
and it would have to be approved by the engineering department. And
Okay.
clarifying the water service, which was item number 2 on the 3rd page.
okay.
And that, I think,
So I have a motion,
I think I seconded that.
and you have a second.
Yeah.
All those in favor of the major modification?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Okay.
thank you very much.
You'll have a signed copy once staff and I get it straightened out.
Good.
Okay.
Thank you. Appreciate your time on this. Thank you.
Next, we have other matters. It's about request for peer review
I recuse myself on that one.
of Beaverbrook Woods definitive subdivision.
Yep, so,
We'll give them a second.
Sure. Can you take the comments outside, the meeting's still going on?
Thank you.
okay, so this was
Fire
a,
away.
this was a request by staff to allow the board to authorize a request, peer review for the Beaverbrook Woods subdivision road and structural plan. It's a fairly significant endeavor in terms of the road building. Not that staff has complete confidence in our in-house engineering staff, it's just, as we learned earlier tonight, it's better to cross your Ts and dot your Is.
Sure.
Specifically, if the overall intent is for the applicant to be asking the town to accept this way, it'd be nice to be able to say to town meeting, here's what we found. So that's pretty much it. And all
So-
it would require is a vote from the board.
So what is the status? The last thing I remember, we
the
approved the
plan is-
cluster zoning,
The
right?
plan has been submitted as a definitive conventional subdivision
So the
plan.
cluster's off.
Correct. So different road, different plan, again, this go around, so it's really just a review of the road as stated in the agenda.
So this is what we learned tonight, there's some waivers being requested.
Correct, yeah, there's waivers being requested, the geometry, there's waivers on the geometry, there's waivers on a few things that, again, staff would just simply like peer reviewed, as well as our planning staff and in-house engineering staff to take a look at it.
So David, how long does that take? Getting back to the same subject of efficiency with the applicant, because this applicant's been here, I remember this, walking the site freezing in January.
Yeah, so this is a new filing, so the clock starts all over
Okay.
again. We have 135 days to get a decision to them. So during that period, we'd like to undergo this peer review. Staff has 10 days to write up a scope of services and get rolling on it. I, much like you, would like to get this done as fast as possible
Okay.
in terms of the peer review section of it.
Well, we approved
The cluster.
cluster.
So now it's.
The applicant chose to
Withdrew it. Okay.
withdraw it and
Okay.
going back and
Okay.
changing their.
Okay,
Yeah.
Yeah, they still have approval for the cluster, so they could in theory go forward with that, but
Okay.
they're opting to go forward with the
Okay,
conventional.
I didn't
They're
know
gonna-
that.
Right, so
Okay.
this is just simply just a peer review so that we can get the traffic looked at properly, just like from our earlier meeting
Yep.
that we've all got memorized. So I'm looking for, unless there's any other discussion associated with this.
Can I ask a question?
Well, it's not a hearing, but it's up to the chair.
This is
Can
the-
I ask a question?
Go ahead.
Since my client will be paying the bill
Okay.
for peer review.
Yeah, sure.
Is a request for peer review, traffic, road geometry, and structural review. You have in-house engineering department, you mentioned earlier this evening when peer reviews were discussed with Attorney Silverstein, who was here, that it is very rare that a project goes out for peer review. I'm trying to think of the last one that we did peer review on. It may have been Danvers Indoor Sports, which was a very big facility. And this is an 8-lot subdivision to go out on peer review, which is an added significant expense, not to mention time, for the applicant, is unusual. If there are specific concerns, I guess I want to understand the scope of, is this traffic peer review for an 8-lot subdivision?
Well, to be fair to the
I think it's got more to
chair,
do with structural.
It's got more to do with structural, and also, I mean, if it's comfortable, I hate to throw you under the bus like this again, Bill, but
Okay.
if the board's comfortable with it, I can work on a scope of services with the chair, and if the chair finds it egregious, we'll amend. We have 10 days to work it out.
But what is structure? I don't
You have a
understand
giant
structure.
retaining wall going through a wetland, which we've never dealt with before at the staff level.
So the structural, because obviously you're not looking at the building. you're
Structural,
looking
traffic,
at-
and road geometry, because you're asking for significant waivers for the road.
But the structural part, that's what I want to understand, because the
retaining wall
structural
holding up the
review
road.
of that retaining wall is not a traffic peer review.
But it
That's
may force the
totally
road in a certain
It will
direction.
change the way the road is built. It's holding the road up in a wetland. So that's the reason for the review.
But that would be, if you're looking at traffic and you're looking at structural, are you talking about two different peer review companies? You use Beta.
We can
generally
use
speaking.
whoever
You
we
can use
want.
anybody you want, but typically the traffic is done by
Well, I think
Beta.
that's the point. The scope of services will include these items. That's the point of going over the scope with the chair.
Well, I think you should be going over the scope of the whole board, and so that we can
Well,
hear and understand it, and that's what
To
I
be
don't
fair, this
understand.
isn't a debate. I guess it was a vote out there for the board. If the board doesn't want to take it up, that's totally okay. It's getting.
Mr. Colantuono, I'll let you briefly.
Thank you. John Colantoni, applicant. Thank you, Chair, for letting me speak. We have no problem if the board wants to move forward to have a third-party review it. For the record, we don't think it's fair because it's the planning department that asked us to do a traffic study report. And we did that, and we paid for it. So now it's another traffic study report and now a structural type thing. Our subdivision that we submitted was over 30 days ago, and it seems like the planning board is just starting to find out that we filed that application. And we were told that we were going to be put on a meeting way before this, and it was going to be advertised. Then we find out from the planning department that, no, we don't want to do that. We want to get all the feedback from the departments first, and hopefully that will save you time. And we had to find that out a few weeks later. So, okay, we'll go with that. Good idea. So we went with that. So if they wanted to send this out for a third-party review on this structural, whatever you want to call it, why wouldn't we have been asked that at the same time that they say they're sending this out for the feedback from the different departments? Because we already have back from the engineering department, Mr. King, with really, in my opinion, and you know I've been in front of this board many a times, pretty favorable things. So I think Scott could tell you some minor adjustments or whatever, but nothing major. This board approved a couple of years ago over a 20-house subdivision. The two people that represent me represented Mr. Thompson, and they do great work. And what we're proposing to do on our road there to go through the wetlands is minute compared to what was done with that development. And now we're asked to pay for this in addition to everything else that we're paying for. But with all that said, you want time efficiency? Well, Mr. Farmer is right that it was January that we walked the site. And the reason that we didn't go with the cluster, for the record, is because the town gave us no incentives to do it. We were hit with 4 or 5 things the night of the meeting that was never discussed with us. The right thing to do was the cluster, but the town made it impossible to do the cluster. So that's why we switched to that. So, no disrespect to David, but he makes it sound like tonight that the reason this is gonna get dragged out more is because we filed a different plan. And that's not true. We filed that plan over 5 weeks ago. So this is all I'm asking of the board, and it's very simple. If the board needs to have their staff behind them and make us pay for this peer review, we'll do that. We respect the board. But all we're asking for is, as a condition of that, that the advertisement goes in for our public hearing in July, for July. We've already lost another couple of months, in July. And if by chance the peer review does not come back and we don't have time to answer it, then it will just be continued, just like any other case is. But it's not fair that all of a sudden the town is holding back advertising for the public hearing, waiting for all this feedback, especially with what's happened in this particular case. So anything the town's asked for, we've done, and it's John Colatoni as his partners that keep picking up the tab, because we happen to do a filing in the change of the regime of the town in the planning department.
Okay, that's, it's
But
gone
that's-
on long enough. I understand.
But,
We-
Mr. Chair, that's
Right.
all we're asking. If the board votes in favor for this peer review, which we don't think is fair, but we respect,
Okay,
we're just asking that, part of that is the public advertisement goes in, so we have a chance to possibly be in front of you in July.
okay.
Thank you so much for the time.
You're welcome. Okay, this got a little bit more complex than we ever expected.
I mean, I think that's a reasonable request, and if we don't need the traffic, let's, for an 8-lot subdivision,
Well-
right? So, I mean, I know that you guys are gonna work on the scope, but
Yeah.
I'm sensitive to efficiency too, right?
I'm
So-
fine with working with staff and about the peer review if the board's okay with it, in terms of whether or not it needs to be. What I can tell you is, I did walk it at a different time than you guys did, and when I was walking through it, I walked it with Aaron. When we were walking through, we were discussing a few things, and I can tell you that whether it's the cluster subdivision or a traditional subdivision, the road work, because of the weird nature of where that road is going in, not just because of the wetlands and the retaining wall, those are part of it.
Yeah.
It gets a little bit more complex, so,
Fair enough?
right now, until I get a chance to sit down and talk with staff, if the board doesn't want to proceed with it, then I can at least talk to them about whether or not we're gonna go forward with it, if you guys feel comfortable with that.
I mean, I have, big picture, if the need is for a peer review, I don't have a problem with it, as long as we can limit it and fast track the public hearing. I think
Okay.
that's a fair
I agree with them, yeah,
request.
it should be fast tracked, yes. So, I'm looking for a motion either to, if the board feels that we're gonna specifically go forward with the peer review, or if they wanna let staff and the chair determine that. I need a motion on either one.
I've never been involved in a peer review before, so.
Well, if you guys feel confident enough that.
I have confidence in you, Bill. If that's what you're asking, I think, I'll make that motion that
Okay.
you and staff determine how we move forward with a peer review. Is that
That's good with me.
okay?
Is that what you're looking for?
Sure,
Okay.
that works.
I need a second.
Second.
Okay, so all those in favor, with the idea that, I'm not trying to amend it, but, we gotta make sure that this is, I need that the applicant is gonna be at least on the docket for July. Is that reasonable also? Whether or not it gets continued beyond that, at least,
We can open it, I mean, we're pretty jammed up, but yeah, it's not, I'm not trying to stall
Right.
intentionally, it's just we are very busy. But
Okay.
yeah,
Okay.
we can make that work.
okay? Does the board feel comfortable with that?
Sure.
Yep.
Another couple late nights, we're okay with that? All right. So I have a motion, and I have a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye, okay. So we'll discuss this
We'll be
either,
spending some quality time.
yeah,
Yeah.
we'll change Indigo a couple times.
Let's hope it doesn't come to that.
I hope not to.
Um,
Okay,
Just before you, sorry,
no, that next on the agenda is briefing.
before you depart really quick, we did a bit of the briefing. The only other thing I wanted to give the board a heads up
Do you
is.
want Jim in here?
Oh, yes, sorry. Sorry, Jim.
Is it me or is it really warm?
It is very warm.
Oh, okay.
Just really quick on, it's hot. Yeah, no, it's not. On June 25th, we'd like to have, I believe you've done this in the past, I was told by the higher-ups that we'll have a land use summit with the planning board that involves hopefully some members of the Board of Selectmen and the zoning board of appeals to go over all matters land use in the town of Danvers. So that was a request
That'll be
made to
short.
me. Yeah, I'm telling you, just so you all are aware, so hopefully you can look forward to that next meeting.
So
Yeah,
is-
we've done that in the past. We've had,
Is that gonna be from 7 to 8 or something like that? And then regular meeting, or?
Yeah, yep, we can make that work.
it's mostly ZBA and us. Although
Yeah.
the other boards are invited,
Certainly,
and
yeah.
usually one or two of the Board of Selectmen will show up.
Yep, we're inviting the Conservation
Yeah,
Commission.
I mean, usually the building inspector will have items that he wants to talk about to try to,
But most of the
Talk about zoning
conversation is
changes.
between the ZBA and us, because it's mostly about zoning changes.
That being said, if you have any matters or anything you'd like to bring up at that meeting, you can email me, we'll get it worked out between the different divisions, hopefully before we get there, so we can all be on the same page.
Okay.
So, that was it.
Okay?
So Dave, can I just ask, can we just, is it appropriate just to get a copy of what the backlog is that you guys are dealing with, so we just have a better feel?
Yep, Francine has that, we can get you that.
Right, because we're still all trying to navigate the summer,
Yep.
right?
Yep,
And I know, I don't know if I can get here on time in the last meeting in July.
Okay.
And because I was trying to figure out when the board was taking its summer vacation, so-called vacation. And it sounds like what I'm hearing is we may not have one.
we are busy, that being said, if the board chooses this evening that they don't want to meet the first meeting in August, we can try to make that work as best as possible.
I mean, I suppose as long as we have quorums, right, we can keep on going.
Correct, yeah,
right?
if you need to step away, then we can still meet as long as we have quorum.
In the quorum's 3?
Quorum's 3, the vote differs depending on what type of permit, but
Yeah,
So I-
supermajority in some
All
situations.
right, so I guess, maybe, Jim, if,
that is why we have an associate.
right, no, I get that.
You're talking about the 23rd of July?
Yeah.
Our next meeting is, well, the July meetings will be, it's gonna
25th.
be the 9th, right? The 9th?
Yep.
23rd.
In the 23rd. The
Correct.
23rd's a problem for me,
Okay,
potentially. I just wanna,
no, thanks for letting us know.
I'm around for both.
Yeah.
I'm bored, I don't go anywhere.
Okay.
All right, so unless there's anything else for staff, I'm looking for a motion to adjourn.
so moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Thank you, good night.
Good night,
Thanks for
Danvers.
hanging in there, everybody.